He had beaten this game 11 times. He knew every quest, every boss, and every branching path. And then he fell asleep on his keyboard and woke up in the body of a useless merchant in a small town by the roadside. In 4 minutes, the chosen hero will walk into his shop, and he'll sell a weapon capable of killing gods for a pittance. Orwin Talbot opens his eyes and stares at a bunch of dried garlic hanging from the ceiling, and his brain produces 2 answers at once. The first is familiar. The garlic's been hanging there for 3 years. I should take it down. The second is foreign and loud. This isn't my room. This isn't my body. This isn't my life. Daniel Kahn clutches his face with both hands. The face is someone else's. Wider at the cheekbones, with coarse 2-day stubble. The hands are someone else's too. Calloused fingers in fingerless gloves. A polka dot apron. A stranger's database unfolds in his mind. 34 years in the life of a shopkeeper from the roadside town of Brackenford. A store on the ground floor. Purchasing on Tuesdays. A sore back from hauling boxes. No wife, no children, no friends. Just a backdrop for someone else's story. And right next to it, a second memory. Daniel Hahn, Seoul, an analyst of an electronics chain. 11 playthroughs of Ayrton Legacy, including a no-death run. He fell asleep at 3 a.m. on his keyboard without saving before the boss fight, and woke up here. He gets up, walks over to the mirror. A weary gaze, dark circles, 34 years of life without a single bright day. And Daniel says one word aloud. Brackenford. He knows this town down to the last cobblestone. A roadside stop in the western lands of the Kingdom of Ayrton. 800 people, 2 inns, 1 blacksmith shop, and 1 general store that, according to canon, exists for exactly one purpose. So that the chosen hero can come here on the first day and turn in his starting gear. After that, the shop becomes a backdrop. Forever. Daniel descends the creaky staircase. His body moves on its own. The merchant's memory guides him like autopilot. His right hand reaches for the teapot. His left hand opens the damper on the coals. His feet land precisely on the planks that don't creak. 12 years of the same movements every morning. He flings open the shutters. Light stings his eyes. The main street lies before him, dusty and sleepy. And then he sees him. A boy of about 16 is walking down the street. His blonde hair sticks out in all directions. A rusty sword dangles from a strap across his back. His left leg drags behind him. His boots are worn through to the soles. The face of a man who's been walking for 3 days and has eaten only sporadically. Ethan Graves, Ayrton's chosen hero. Day 1. Daniel holds his breath. He knows this guy better than his own father. 11 playthroughs, every dialogue, every quest, every choice. The second son of A who received a vision from the oracle and left home with a rusty sword and 3 copper coins in his pocket. In 4 minutes, he'll walk into this shop. He'll place the sword on the counter and ask how much they'll give him for it. And the rusty sword will remain on the shelf and never appear in the game again. Just a rusty sword. For everyone, except those in the know. And this is where the strangest part begins. Daniel swallows hard. The blade of the Silent Dawn, the legendary weapon of the final act. In its unawakened state, it looks like a piece of rusty iron. 0 attack, 0 defense, 0 magic. But its hidden potential is infinite. The condition for awakening it? To personally slay a high-rank undead at sunset. After that, the blade begins to cut through gods. In 11 playthroughs, Daniel has activated it 7 times. He knows more about this sword than the developers do. And in 3 minutes, the boy will sell it for 3 copper coins. Daniel smiles slowly. His hands tremble slightly. Not from fear, from excitement. The bell above the door jingles. Ethan steps over the threshold. He takes the sword strap off his shoulder. He sets down a battered shield and a pair of leather gloves beside it. He says he needs money for potions and asks how much they'll give him for everything. Daniel picks up the sword. He twirls it. Rust runs along the entire blade in brown patches. The hilt is cracked at the pommel. To any merchant in Ayrton, this is junk. 3 copper coins at most. But Daniel sees something else. He sees hidden properties that no one else in this world can read. He sees a weapon that, in 2 months, will decide the fate of the world. 3 copper coins, he says. Ethan nods without haggling. He needs potions, and this is just a rusty sword. But then Daniel does something that isn't in the canon. He looks at the boy, at his skinny wrists, at his worn-out boots with a hole by the little toe, at the way Ethan slumps as if he's used to being overlooked. The farmer's second son, who was told to go save the world, but given nothing. Daniel reaches under the counter. He pulls out 2 red potions, a flask of water, a pouch of dried meat, and a sturdy leather belt. He places everything in front of Ethan and says that the shield and gloves are fair game, and the strap is free because his old one is falling apart. He adds something else. He says there's an abandoned mill east of Littlewind, and you shouldn't go there alone until the end of the month. Just trust a merchant. Ethan blinks. Then again, merchants don't talk like that. They say, "Hello, traveler, and we have discounts on torches." They don't give advice. They don't feed you for free. They don't look you in the eye as if they see something you can't see yourself. Ethan takes the supplies. He puts on the new belt. It fits perfectly. He opens his mouth, then closes it. He nods and walks out. A bell jingles. Daniel stands alone. Before him is a rusty sword worth 3 copper coins. He locks the door. He flips the closed sign. He places the sword on the workbench in the back room and covers it with a canvas cloth. And he laughs quietly, because he just bought a weapon capable of slicing through gods for the price of 3 loaves of bill. And it seems he saved the chosen hero's life. On the 12th day of the canon, a flock of wyverns appears at that mill. A group of 3 manages to handle them. The lone wyvern perishes. But according to the canon, Ethan goes there alone on the 9th day. With a single sentence, Daniel has shifted the plot line. He understands this, and that scares him. The kettle whistles. Daniel pours himself some mint tea and sits down at the counter. He takes a sip. The tea is real. The mint is real. The warmth of the mug in his palms is real. There's no taste in games, but here there is. He looks around his shop. Dusty shelves, crooked price tags. Half the inventory is useless. A quarter is past its expiration date. As an analyst, he sees a disaster. As a player, he sees an opportunity. He knows what will happen in a week. A caravan of spices from the south will get stuck on a washed-out road, and the price of herbs will double. He knows what will happen in 2 weeks. Orcs will burn down the sawmill, and flax will become 10 times more expensive. He knows what will happen in a month. The Heroes Guild will announce a recruitment drive, and dozens of newbies will flood into the city, needing potions, ropes, torches, and rations. He remembers every economic wave, every shortage, every market crash. The patch made the merchants more dynamic and the demons smarter. But the economy in the first few weeks is the same. That's enough. Daniel opens Orvin's notebook for orders. He picks up a quill. Flax. All the flax he can find. Red herbs for potions. Bandages. Oil for torches. Ropes. Leather. And good quality glass for vials. Because in a month, every potion vial will be worth its weight in gold. The first 3 days, Daniel didn't sleep well. He'd doze off for 2 hours, then jump up and go check his notes. Orvin's memory gave him the contacts, Daniel's memory gave him the plan. Together, they worked like the two engines of a single machine. On the morning of the first day after meeting Ethan, he went to see Gregor Most. Gregor was the only wholesale flax buyer in the area, a fat man with a red face and a habit of haggling until he was hoarse. Orwin bought flax from him once a month for 1 silver coin per bale, in small batches, like everyone else. Daniel walked in and said he wanted to buy the whole lot. Gregor burst out laughing. Then he looked at the money Orwin had laid out on the table and stopped laughing. 18 silver coins. The shop's entire savings from a year and a half. Daniel bought 22 bales of flax at a discounted wholesale price. Gregor decided the merchant had gone mad and gladly took the money. 12 days later, they, the orcs, would burn down the eastern sawmill. Shipments of lumber and fiber would be halted for 3 weeks. The price of flax would rise 8-fold. 22 bales would turn into 176 silver coins. But that was later. For now, Daniel didn't even have enough money for dinner. He ate some crackers from Orwin's pantry and drank water from the well. On the second day, he set to work on the shop. He walked down every shelf. He took down every item. He examined them. His gamer's memory worked like a scanner. Here's a bundle of dried sage. To everyone else, it's just a spice that costs a copper coin a bunch. To Daniel, it's an ingredient for a fire resistance potion. In 2 months, when the archdemon of the south starts burning the forests, people will be paying in silver for this sage. He set it aside. Here's a bag of river salt. Useless junk. But Daniel knew that salt from the Cologne River contained a mineral that boosted enchantments by 15%. No alchemist in the Western lands knew this. It was information from a secret guide that Daniel had found on a Korean forum at 4 in the morning during his 6th playthrough. He moved the salt over to the sage. In 3 hours, he had sorted through all the goods. A third turned out to be junk. Another third was more valuable than Orwin had thought. The last third was on the wrong shelves. Bandages were lying next to candles. Ropes were piled up with grain. Torches were standing against the wall where water was dripping. Daniel rearranged everything. Bandages and medical supplies went on the shelf by the entrance, right where anyone who walked in would see them. Food and water in the center, tools and supplies along the right wall, rare ingredients in the back room behind the counter. He rewrote every single price tag. He didn't raise the prices. He even lowered them in some cases, but he added descriptions. Before, the shelf simply read, river salt, 2 kopecks. Now it read, salt from the River Cologne, pure, suitable for cooking and for enchantments. No one in town knew that was true, but when people who understood magic came here in a month, they would see that inscription and realize that the merchant knew his wares. On the 3rd day, the first customer arrived. Daniel was sitting behind the counter, taking inventory, when the door opened. The bell jingled. A small figure in a worn leather cloak slipped into the shop. Small, wiry, black hair cut unevenly, as if it had been snipped with a knife in the dark. Her cheekbones were scratched. Her eyes were wary, like those of a small animal that had entered a burrow and was checking for traps. Ari Vaughn. Daniel recognized her instantly. In the Ayrton Legacy canon, she didn't even have a name, just a nameless Girl Scout who brought rabbit skins to sell once a week. 2 months later, she died in a skirmish with goblins. A single line in the newspaper, not even a quest, just a background event. She silently approached the counter and laid out 3 rabbit pelts, clean, well-skinned, the work of a master. Daniel picked one up. He examined it. The fur was thick, no cuts. The pelt had been skinned in a single motion from tail to head. That's how hunters with 20 years of forest experience teach it. And this girl was 17. She waited in silence. Orwin usually gave a copper coin per pelt. 3 pelts, 3 copper coins. Ari would nod each time and leave. Without a word, Daniel placed the pelt on the counter. He looked at the girl, at her boots. His gamer's memory picked up on a detail Orwin had never noticed. The boots were 2 sizes too big. Men's boots, worn out. The insoles were missing. The left boot was tied with twine because the sole was coming apart. Ari Vaughn hunted in the woods every day in boots that barely stayed on her feet. Daniel said the hides were excellent and that he'd pay 5 copper coins for 3. Ari looked up. For the first time during her entire visit, she looked him straight in the eye. There was no gratitude in her gaze. There was suspicion. NPCs don't pay more than they're supposed to. That doesn't happen. Daniel explained calmly. He said the quality of these hides was above average, that the fur was thick and undamaged, that with work like this, he could resell them not as raw material, but as ready-to-sew hides, and that a fair price for such quality was higher than what he'd paid before. Ari listened. Her expression didn't change. Then she nodded briefly and took the coins. She turned toward the door. And then Daniel added that he'd need more hides next week, and that if she could bring them regularly, he was willing to pay the same rate, 5 for 3. Ari stopped at the door. She turned around. She nodded once more, and she left. Daniel breathed a sigh of relief. First contact, the simplest and the most important. He hadn't tried to help her. He hadn't given her advice. He hadn't shown sympathy. He'd simply paid a fair price for honest work. For Ari Vaughn, who had been treated as disposable her whole life, it was more than just money. For the next 4 days, he worked like a dog, unloading crates, repairing shelves, replacing hinges on the shutters, mopping the floors, washing the apron, wiping down the windows. Orwin Talbot's shop had been neglected for 12 years. Orwin worked like a machine. He opened in the morning, sold what was asked for, closed in the evening. No initiative, no interest, just the routine of a programmed character. Daniel broke that routine with every move he made. He fixed the creaky step at the entrance. He hung up a new sign with the hours of operation. He placed a bucket of clean water and a dipper by the door for any passerby. A small thing, but people noticed. By the end of the week, those who had previously walked right by began coming into the shop. Tom the baker stopped by for some twine and was surprised to find that the twine was now sorted by thickness. Martha, the blacksmith's wife, came in for some needles and saw that they were arranged by size in a neat little box. Peter, the guard, stopped by for some candles and was told that the ones costing a copper coin each burned twice as long as the ones costing 2. Little things. Taken individually, they mean nothing, but together, they created something that had never existed in Brackenford before. The feeling that the merchant actually cared. Ari came back 5 days later, 4 pelts, 1 fox pelt. Daniel examined the fox pelt. Red fur without a single cut. Magnificent work. He paid 2 silver coins for the fox pelt and 2 copper coins each for the rabbit pelts. Ari stared at the silver coins on the counter and didn't move. Then she took them. Then she stood there. Daniel waited. Ari asked if he had any strong twine for her boots. Daniel reached under the counter. He pulled out some twine. Then he paused. He looked at her boots and said nothing. He gave her the twine for free. He said it was no big deal and that good suppliers deserve bonuses. Ari left. Daniel took out his notebook and wrote, Ari 1, shoe size approximately 36, narrow foot, needs lightweight hiking boots with reinforced toes. He needs a shoemaker, or better yet, he needs a blacksmith who works with leather. He needed Meyer Shin. But it would be another 2 months before he saw her, if the canon was right. He closed the notebook and looked out the window. The sun was setting behind the rooftops of Brackenford. His first week in a strange world was coming to an end. The shop was still standing. The sword lay in the back room, under a canvas cover. Ethan had headed east, but past the mill. At least, that's what Daniel hoped. 22 bales of flax were waiting for their moment in a rented barn outside town, and the little hunter, with boots 2 sizes too big, would bring the hides in 5 days. Daniel closed the shutters. He went upstairs. He lay down on Orvin's bed, and for the first time in a week, he thought of Seoul, of the empty studio in Gangnam, about the monitor on the desk, about the half-drunk coffee that had probably already developed a film on top. No one was waiting for him there. Here, 22 bales of flax, rabbit skins, and a rusty sword hidden under a canvas sheet were waiting for him. He closed his eyes. The taste of Orvin's mint tea still lingered on his tongue. A strange thought crossed his mind. On the 9th day, what Daniel had been waiting for and dreading finally happened. In the morning, he was standing behind the counter, arranging bundles of sage, when he saw smoke on the horizon through the window. To the east, far away, a thin gray streak rose into the cloudless sky. The sawmill. Daniel froze. According to tradition, the sawmill was set ablaze on the 12th day. Today was the 9th. 3 days early. Patch 2.0 had already changed the schedule. This was both good and bad. Bad because his knowledge was becoming less accurate. Good because he already had the flax. By noon, a messenger had run into town. Orcs had attacked the eastern highway. The sawmill was burned down. The timber convoy was destroyed. The road was blocked for at least a week. By evening, rumors were spreading through Brackenford. Prices for flax and timber had already begun to rise. Small merchants rushed to buy up whatever remained from whoever they could. There was nothing left, because it was all already stored in the barn outside town in 22 bales bearing Gregor Most's seal. Daniel didn't sell right away. He waited 2 days. On the 11th day, the tailor Gilbert came to see him, a short, thin man with perpetually narrowed eyes. He needed flax for an order from the garrison, 20 sets of for the guards. Urgent. Daniel sold him 4 bales for 3 silver coins each, 3 times the purchase price. Gilbert grimaced but paid. He had no choice. On the 12th day, Mrs. Crenny, the widow, came by. She needed flax for bandages. She ran a small infirmary at the Church of the Light. Daniel sold her 2 bales for 1 silver coin each, at his cost price, with no markup. Mrs. Crenny looked at him for a long moment. Then she said thank you. Then she left. It was a conscious decision. Daniel knew that in 3 weeks the flow of wounded from the eastern road would quadruple. Mrs. Crenny and her bandages would save lives. 1 silver coin for a bale of flax that would yield bandages for 20 soldiers. That wasn't a loss. It was an investment in his reputation and in the people who would remember that Orwin Talbot didn't jack up the price when he could have. By the end of the 2nd week, he had sold 14 bales. He put the remaining 8 back in the shop, on the shelf, at the current market price, which was already 6 times higher than the purchase price. The net profit for 2 weeks amounted to 120 silver coins, more than Orwin earned in a year. That evening, Daniel sat poring over his notebook, staring at the numbers. 120 silver, plus 8 bales in stock, plus the reputation of a man who had both made money and helped others at the same time, plus Mrs. Crenn, who was now telling everyone that Orwin had sold the flax at cost. The next day, he went to see Bert, the shoemaker. Bert was old and slow, but he made sturdy shoes. Daniel ordered a pair of lightweight leather boots, size 36, narrow last, reinforced toe, soft double leather insole, and a hidden pocket on the inside of the shaft, for a knife. Bert asked who they were for. Daniel said they were for a regular customer. Bert shrugged and named his price, 8 silver coins. Daniel paid 10 and asked him to make them well. Ari came by 2 days later, 6 rabbit skins and 1 deer skin. Daniel paid her fairly. He counted out the coins in front of her. He placed the money on the counter. Ari took the money and turned toward the door. Daniel said, "Wait." He pulled a bundle from under the counter. He placed it in front of her. Ari looked at the bundle, then at Daniel, then back at the bundle. She didn't move. Daniel said it was an advance payment for future deliveries, that she needed proper shoes for work, and that in the boots she was wearing now, she'd twist her ankle in the woods before she brought in the next shipment. He said that this wasn't a gift, but a business investment, and that he'd deduct the cost from future deliveries as payment for the visit. Ari unwrapped the canvas. The boots were inside. New, dark, smooth leather, neat stitching. The toe reinforced with a double layer. The insole was soft, and a pocket for a knife right where it should be. Ari picked up one boot, turned it over, looked at the sole, ran her finger along the seam. Her expression didn't change, but her hands were trembling. She sat down right on the floor by the counter, took off her worn-out boots, put on the new ones, stood up. She shifted her weight from foot to foot. She walked to the door and back. The boots fit perfectly. They didn't pinch. They didn't slip. For the first time in years, her foot felt stable inside them. Ari stood in the middle of the store and looked down at her feet. Daniel saw her shoulders tremble. Just once. She didn't lift her head. She stood there like that for a few seconds. Then she turned and left, quickly, without looking back. The door closed. Daniel stood behind the counter. On the floor at his feet lay two old, worn-out men's boots, 2 sizes too big. Ari hadn't taken them. Either she didn't want them, or she forgot. He picked them up and threw them away. The next morning, Daniel found a bundle of 10 rabbit skins on the shop's doorstep, the best he'd ever seen. No note, no knock on the door, just the skins on the threshold. Daniel smiled and carried them inside. The days went by. Business was good. Word spread quickly that Orvin's shop had sold flax at cost to the wounded. People began to stop by more often. Not everyone bought anything, not just looked around, but they came in. And that meant they were taking note, that there were bandages and potions on the shelf by the entrance, that the ropes were sorted by thickness, that the merchant knew his wares and didn't lie about the quality. Daniel was building up his stock. He bought red herbs from Granny Mora outside the city. He ordered 20 vials of good glass for potions from the glassblower Pen. He found an old leather worker named Villa who made belts and bandages. Every purchase was precise. Not a single extra coin, not a single extra item. Only what was needed. Only what Daniel knew from his 11 playthroughs. On the 17th day, something happened he hadn't expected. A woman of about 22 walked into the shop. Slender. Wearing glasses. Her apron was stained with reagents. Her fingers were yellow from chemicals. Her eyes were red from lack of sleep. She stood at the counter and silently stared at the shelf of herbs. Haven Lee. Daniel recognized her, and his heart sank. According to the canon, Haven was supposed to appear on the 30th day. 13 days early. That could only mean one thing. Her teacher had died earlier, and she had already begun to fall. Haven asked if he had any white mallow root. Her voice was steady, too steady, like someone clinging on by a thread. Daniel looked at her. White mallow root, an ingredient for 3 recipes, a sedative, a sleep aid, and a poison if overdosed. He took the root off the shelf, placed it on the counter, and instead of quoting a price, he said something else. He said he knew the Veland School's formula, that he needed a regular supplier of potions, 8 recipes, payment in advance. He needs quality, not quantity. And he needs her because no one else in the Western lands can brew this correctly. Haven stood motionless. Her glasses glinted slightly in the light from the window. She asked how he knew about the Veland School. Daniel said that a good merchant knows his craftsmen. That was a lie. He knew about Vlon's school from the description of a side quest he'd completed on his third playthrough. But the lie worked. Havon nodded silently. She took the route. She left. She didn't pay. Daniel didn't remind her. 3 hours later, she returned with a 16-page price list, small, neat handwriting, names, ingredients, deadlines, prices. Daniel read the first page and realized he'd struck gold. Havon Lee wasn't just a good pharmacist. She was a brilliant pharmacist who didn't know her own worth. Half her prices were half the market rate. He didn't tell her that. Not yet. He simply signed the first order. 10 healing potions, 5 mana restoration potions, 3 poison resistance potions. Payment in advance, as promised. Havon took the money. She nodded and left. This time the door closed quietly. No slam. Daniel sat down at the counter and jotted it down in his notebook. Havon Lee, apothecary, Vlon School. She arrived 13 days earlier than in the canon. Her teacher is dead. Her situation is unstable. She needs a job. She needs a purpose. She needs someone to tell her that her knowledge matters. He closed the notebook and looked out the window. The evening sun cast a golden glow over the rooftops of Brackenford. 17 days in a foreign world. Leong had turned a profit. Ari was wearing new boots. Havon had brought the price list. The blade lay in the back room. Everything was going according to plan. Almost. Because the cannon was already cracking, and Daniel didn't know how long his knowledge would last. On the 20th day, a man from the Heroes Guild arrived in Brackenford. Daniel saw him from the window and immediately recognized who it was. A tall man in a gray traveling cloak with a silver brooch shaped like a sword at the collar. The brooch signified the rank of inspector. Not a fighter, not a mage, an official. A man who travels from city to city, checking readiness and writing reports. According to canon, the guild inspector was supposed to arrive in Brackenford on the 35th day. 15 days early. The storyline was unraveling faster and faster. The inspector's name was Ray Cullen. Daniel knew him from the game. A minor NPC. He appears in 2 scenes. He gives a quest to gather supplies for the garrison, and then he disappears. No face, no personality. Just a function. But now a real person stood before Daniel. Tall, around 30 years old, attentive eyes. He moved like someone accustomed to noticing details. Ray walked into the shop around noon. He looked around, ran his finger along the shelf, checked the price tags, walked along the wall lined with supplies. He stopped at the bandages. He picked up a roll, unrolled it, checked the quality of the fabric, put it back. Then he walked up to the counter and asked if they sold anything useful for a traveler. A standard question. A standard check. Daniel gave a standard answer. He listed the merchandise: potions, bandages, ropes, torches, dry rations, flasks. Ray listened and nodded. Then he asked about the potions, who made them and what their quality was like. Daniel said the potions were supplied by the apothecary at Vlon School. Ray raised an eyebrow. Vlon School was considered one of the best in the Western lands, but everyone thought it had closed after the old master's death. Daniel confirmed that the master had died, but his apprentice was alive and working, and her potions were just as good as her teacher's. Ray asked for 1 potion to sample. Daniel pulled a vial from under the counter. Havon had brewed the first batch 3 days ago, 10 healing potions, each in a fine glass vial with a cork sealed with wax. Daniel had checked every vial himself. Ray opened it. He sniffed it. He held it up to the light. The color was right. The consistency was right. The scent was pure, without any impurities. He closed the vial and said he was impressed. Then he asked how much. Daniel named the price, 2 silver coins apiece. Ray didn't haggle. He bought 3. Then he paused and said that the guild would soon announce a recruitment drive for new heroes. that a flood of newcomers would pass through Brackenford in the coming month, and that the guild needed reliable supply points in every town along the western route. He asked if the shop could handle the volume. Daniel replied that it could. Ray nodded. He jotted something down in his notebook. Then he left. The door closed. Daniel stood behind the counter, feeling his heart pound. Here it was. The Heroes Guild had taken notice of the shop. According to the canon, this happened much later, and only because the shop happened to be in the way of the plot. Now Daniel had drawn attention to himself, with Haven's potions. It was both a good thing and a dangerous thing. Good because a contract with the guild meant a steady income and protection. No one would touch the guild's supply point, not bandits, not competitors, not even the Chamber of Commerce. Dangerous because the guild's attention meant questions. Who was Orwin Talbot? How did a merchant from the backwoods have connections to the apothecary at Veland's school? Why were his potions better than those in the capital's shops? And most importantly, how did he know that flax would go up in price? Rumors were already circulating. Gregor Most was telling everyone that Orwin had bought up his entire stock 3 days before the fire. It was as if he'd known. Daniel realized he needed to be more careful, but he couldn't stop now. On the 23rd day, Emma Carrick arrived. Daniel hadn't expected her so soon. According to canon, the former paladin would appear closer to the 35th day. But the canon was falling apart at the seams, and people were moving faster than they should have. She arrived in the evening, tall, broad-shouldered, red hair braided into a plait, a sword in a simple scabbard at her belt, a leather breastplate over a traveling shirt. Her face was open. Her eyes were tired, not physically, but deeper than that, like someone who'd been carrying something heavy for too long and had finally let go. She walked up to the counter and asked if there was any work. Just like that, no preamble. Is there any work? Daniel looked at her. A player's memory unfurled like a scroll. Emma Carrick, a former paladin of the Order of the Silver Dawn. The order had been disbanded by royal decree for a lack of zeal, a euphemism that meant the order had refused to carry out a dirty order and had been punished for it. After the disbandment, Emma had joined the mercenaries. She'd take on any job. According to the pattern, by the 35th day she'd start drinking, and by the 40th she'd become a shadow of her. For now she was still holding on, but Daniel could see the signs. Tattered clothes, an empty wallet, and that particular look in the eyes of someone who had been accustomed to serving an ideal and had lost that ideal. Daniel told her there was work available, security for a shop, escorting supply runs, and possibly training apprentices in the future. Shifts from dawn to dusk. Pay was 5 silver coins a week, plus meals and a room upstairs. 1 day off every 7 days. Emma listened. Her expression didn't change. 5 silver coins a week wasn't much for a fighter of her caliber. Mercenaries earned twice as much in a single day. But mercenaries worked on a case-by-case basis, and Daniel was offering a steady position. Stability, routine. The very things Emma Carrick lacked more than anything in the world, though she didn't even know it herself. She asked only one thing. Why did he need security for the shop? Daniel told the truth, part of it at least. He said the business was growing, that soon there would be many newcomers from the guild in town, that competitors might start putting pressure on him, and that he needed someone he could trust with security. Emma nodded. No questions, no haggling. She just nodded and asked when to start. Tomorrow, Daniel said. The next morning, Emma arrived at dawn. Daniel showed her the shop, the back room, the storage area, the room upstairs. Small. A bed, a table, a chair, a window overlooking the courtyard. Clean. Emma set her bag on the bed. She took out a whetstone and a sword. She sat down on the chair. She began sharpening. With a familiar motion, calm, rhythmic. Daniel watched her and thought that this was the first morning in a long time when Emma Carrick knew exactly what she had to do. Sharpen the sword, wait for her shift, do her job, get paid. Simple rules after a year of chaos. Sometimes people don't need grand goals. Sometimes people need a clear shift and a sincere thank you at the end of the day. By the end of the 25th day, the shop had changed. Daniel stood behind the counter. Emma stood by the door. In the back room, Haven's potions lay on a shelf in nice glass bottles. Every 5 days, a group of bottles from Ari would appear on the threshold. 4 people. Not friends, not family. For now, just people connected by work and money. But Daniel knew this was the beginning. The 26th day brought trouble. A man in an expensive dark blue doublet approached the shop. Behind him were 2 men in identical gray frock coats, each carrying a folder under his arm. The man in the doublet stopped at the entrance. He read the sign. He looked at Emma by the door. He smiled, politely but coldly. He entered. He introduced himself as an assistant to Master Valancourt, head of the Chamber of Commerce for the Western Lands. He said that the chamber was conducting a routine inspection of retail outlets in the region. He said it was a routine matter and wouldn't take long. 2 men in gray frock coats had already opened their folders and begun taking notes. One was inspecting the shelves. The other was asking Daniel for the merchandise documents. Daniel handed over everything they asked for. Orwin kept meticulous records. 12 years of bookkeeping in identical notebooks. Every purchase, every sale, dates, suppliers, amounts. Welland's assistant flipped through the notebooks and smiled. Everything was in order. But Daniel saw how he lingered on the last few pages, the ones where Daniel had recorded his own purchases. Flax. 22 bales 3 days before the fire. Red herbs in quantities a small shop had never purchased before. Glass for vials. A contract with the pharmacist at Velland's school. The assistant closed the notebook. He smiled again. He said everything was in order, that the audit was complete, that the chamber appreciated his cooperation, and he left. 2 men in gray frock coats followed him. The door closed. Emma looked at Daniel. He was standing behind the counter, staring at the closed door. Valancourt, head of the Chamber of Commerce. According to the lore, he was the antagonist of a side quest about a trade monopoly in the Western Lands. A quest that 90% of players skipped because the reward was small and there was a lot of text. Daniel completed it every single time. He knew Valancourt. Smart, patient, ruthless toward those who broke his rules. And now he knew about the flax. Daniel took out a notebook and wrote a single word. Court. He circled it. Then he looked up and told Emma that starting tomorrow, the door would be locked with 2 locks at night. After the visit from the chamber's representatives, Daniel hadn't slept for 2 nights. Not out of fear, out of calculation. He sat at the desk in his room, probably and filled page after page. What Valancourt knew, what he could do, what tools he had at his disposal. The Western Lands Chamber of Commerce controlled pricing in 12 cities. The chamber had its own warehouses, its own suppliers, and its own routes. Every merchant in the region worked either with the chamber or against it. Orwin Talbot had worked with it for 12 years, quietly, unobtrusively. He bought goods through approved suppliers. He sold at set prices. He kept a low profile. But now, in the space of a month, Daniel had purchased flax outside the approved supply chain. He sold it for 3 times the market price. He entered into a direct contract with an independent apothecary. And he caught the attention of the Heroes Guild. For Valancourt, this was an insult. A small shop in the backwoods was playing by its own rules, and thriving at that. This could not go unpunished. Daniel knew from the canon how Valan operated. First, inspections. Then, pressure on suppliers. Then, rumors. Then, if nothing else worked, accidental mishaps. A fire, a robbery, damaged goods. Nothing too blatant, everything done with clean hands. There were two shields against this, a contract with the Heroes Guild, if he could secure it, and reputation. It's harder to quietly destroy a man whom the townspeople love. Daniel closed his notebook and went downstairs. It was early morning on the 28th. Emma was already standing by the door, sword at her belt, back straight. Her eyes were calm. She had stood like that every morning since day one, right at dawn, never late, never needing a reminder. Daniel nodded to her. She nodded back. That was enough. He opened the shutters and began his usual day. The first client arrived an hour later. A young man in his 20s, leather armor, a short sword, a Heroes Guild patch on his shoulder. A rookie, the first of the new wave. The guild had announced a recruitment drive. Daniel knew that. Ray Cullen had said it would happen soon. The guy walked in and asked if there were any healing potions. Daniel pulled out a vial. Haven had brewed a new batch 2 days ago. The guy bought 2. Then he looked at the shelf with ropes and bought a coil. Then he asked if there was a map of the surrounding area. Daniel didn't have any maps, but he knew the terrain from 11 runs better than any map could. He took a sheet of paper and, in 2 minutes, sketched by hand a sketch of the nearest trails: the eastern trail, the northern clearing, the river ford by the mill, the caves on the southern hill, and he marked with a cross 3 places a newcomer should avoid. The young man stared at the map with wide eyes. He asked how the merchant knew all this. Daniel said he'd been trading in these parts for 30 years and that hunters tell him a lot. The young man took the map, thanked him, and left. A second newcomer followed him, then a third. By noon, 8 people had passed through the shop. Daniel sold each one exactly what they needed: potions, bandages, torches, and ropes. And he drew a map for each one, the same one, but with markings for their specific route. It took the whole day. That evening, Daniel counted his takings. 26 silver coins in a single day. Orwin's record over 10 years had been 4 silver coins. But the money wasn't the main thing. What mattered was that 8 newcomers to the Heroes Guild now knew there was a shop in Brackenford where the merchant gave good advice and drew maps. In 3 days, they'd tell others. In a week, Orwin Talbot would be a name known to every rookie on the Western Trail. That was better protection than any castle. On the 30th day, Haven came to the shop, not with potions. She arrived in the morning, early. The shop wasn't open yet. Emma let her in and called for Daniel. Havon stood at the counter. Her eyes were red, not from chemicals, but from tears. She said she had nowhere to brew, that the landlord of the house where she rented a room had tripled the rent, that she couldn't afford to pay that much, and that without a workshop she couldn't fill orders. Daniel listened. Then he asked who the landlord was. Havon gave a name: Matthew Grace. Daniel knew that name. Matthew Grace owned 4 houses in Brackenford, and he was a man of the Chamber of Commerce. Velon Court's first move. Not through the shop, through the people around them. Daniel was silent for 3 seconds. Then he told Havon to follow him. He led her through the shop into the back room. From the back room down a narrow hallway to the rear room that Orwin used as a storage area. Small, but dry. Stone floor, ventilation through a window near the ceiling. Daniel said this room could be converted into a workshop. Not ideal, but a workbench would fit. And a cauldron would fit. And shelves for reagents. No charge. Instead of rent, Haven would make 1 free batch of potions a month for the shop. She can sell the rest however she wants and set her own prices. Haven looked at the room, then at Daniel, then back at the room. She asked why. Daniel said he needed a good apothecary on hand and that it was just business. Haven took off her glasses, wiped them, put them back on. She said she needed a day to move her equipment. Daniel nodded. The next day, Haven moved her things. 2 cauldrons, a set of mortars, 3 shelves of dried herbs and roots, a dozen leather-bound books, scales, test tubes, and a small portrait of an elderly man in a wooden frame which she hung above her workbench, her teacher. Emma helped carry the boxes, silently, without asking questions. When everything was in place, Haven stood in the middle of her new workshop. She turned around. She looked at the cauldron on the table, at the herbs on the shelves, at the portrait on the wall. And for the first time in all the days Daniel had known her, she smiled. Just a little. The corner of her mouth. And she said the price list needed updating. Daniel replied, "Go ahead and update it." That evening, he was sitting alone in the shop. Emma had gone on her rounds. Haven was working in the workshop. From behind the door came the steady thud of a pestle against the bottom of a cauldron. Ari hadn't come by in 2 days. That was normal. She showed up whenever she wanted, like a cat. Daniel opened his notebook, the page with the calculations. He jotted down the current balance. Money. 114 silver coins. Good. Staff. Emma. Security. Haven. Apothecary. Ari. Pelt supplier. Threats. The Chamber of Commerce. The first move has been made. A blow against Haven through the landlord. Repelled. There will be a second move. Allies. The Heroes Guild. Just interest for now. We need a contract. Goods. Haven's potions. Ari's hides. Basic supplies. Maps for newbies. Artifact. The Blade of the Quiet Dawn. It's in the back room. Waiting. Cannon. The discrepancy is growing. Haven is 13 days ahead. Emma is 10 days ahead. The sawmill is 3 days ahead. The guild inspector is 15 days ahead. The world is speeding up. Daniel closed his notebook and looked at the blade. It lay on the workbench beneath the canvas, rusty, silent, dead to everyone except those who know. Daniel placed his hand on the canvas. The metal beneath the fabric was slightly warm, as if it were breathing, as if it were waiting. He withdrew his hand and left the back room. He locked the door. He went upstairs. He lay down on the bed. The 30th day in the world of Eritan. A month. 1 month out of Orwin Talbot's body. The shop was still standing. People were nearby. Money was in the account. And the enemy had already made its first move. Tomorrow would be the 31st day. And Daniel knew for certain that tomorrow, a man he hadn't expected to see for another month would enter Brackenford. Because the world was accelerating, and the one whom the canon had designated to appear on the 60th day was heading here right now. Hungry, with scorched palms, wearing a cloak draped over a stranger's shoulder. Daniel closed his eyes. Sora Kim, the fugitive princess. She was coming for him, and he had no idea why so soon. Sora Kim walked into the shop on the 31st day at exactly noon. Daniel was standing behind the counter counting bubbles when the bell jingled. He looked up and saw the girl, petite. Her light hair was tangled and dirty. Over her shoulders was a brown men's traveling cloak, clearly taken from someone twice her size. Underneath the cloak was a dress that had once been expensive. Now the hem was torn off at the knees and covered in dust. Her feet were in worn-out sandals. Her face was pale and gaunt, with a sharp chin. A noble face. You don't see faces like that among peasant women or merchants' daughters. But what caught Daniel's eye most were her hands. Her palms were scorched. Her skin was red and blistered from her fingers to her wrists. Burns from mana overexertion. A sorceress who had spent her magic until she was completely drained and kept spending it anyway. Sora stood by the door and didn't move. Her eyes were sunken, hungry. She stared at the shelf by the entrance where bread and dried meat lay and swallowed hard. Daniel knew who was standing before him. Sora Kim, the princess of the Principality of Valinor, a sorceress of the combat school. According to canon, she was supposed to appear on the 60th day in full regalia with guards and an entourage, a quest character for the third act. Here she stood alone, without guards, without regalia, without food, with burned hands. 30 days ahead of schedule. Something had happened in Valinor. Something that wasn't in the canon. Daniel didn't ask. He pulled a bowl from under the counter. He put some bread in it, a piece of dried meat. He poured water from a flask. He set it in front of her, and said it was free for first-time visitors. Sora looked at the bowl, then at Daniel, then back at the bowl. Pride battled hunger for about 3 seconds. Hunger won. She took the bread and began to eat, quickly, greedily, not like a princess, like someone who hadn't eaten in 2 days. Daniel waited. When the bowl was empty, Sora sat up straight. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and said she needed a job. Any job, for food and a roof over her head. Her voice was steady. Her chin was held high. Even hungry and burned, she carried herself like someone accustomed to giving orders. Daniel looked at her hands. The burns were severe. Without treatment, inflammation would set in within 3 days. He said there was work, but first she needed to show her hands to the apothecary. He called Haven from the workshop. Haven came out. She saw the burns. She took off her glasses, put them back on. Silently, she took Sora by the wrist and led her into the workshop. 20 minutes later, they both returned. Sora's hands were wrapped in clean bandages soaked in green ointment. It smelled like mint and something bitter. Haven told Daniel that the burns weren't critical, but she wouldn't be able to use her hands for at least 5 days. Daniel nodded. He looked at Sora. She stood up straight, waiting for a decision. She was used to waiting for decisions. Her whole life had consisted of other people's decisions about her. Daniel said there was only one job for now: washing the counter, wiping down the shelves, and sweeping the floor. Once her hands had healed, they could discuss something more serious. The pay was 3 silver coins a week, plus food and a place in the attic. Sora nodded. No haggling, no objections. The princess agreed to wash floors for 3 silver coins. Daniel led her upstairs. The attic was small and dusty. A low ceiling, a narrow window, an old mattress in the corner, a blanket. Nothing else. Sora looked around. She sat down on the mattress. She ran her bandaged hand over the blanket, and suddenly she asked quietly, "Was it clean? Was it dirty?" It wasn't just a simple question. The princess asked because she had never in her life slept on someone else's blanket. Daniel said he'd washed it last week. Sora nodded. She lay down. A minute later, she was asleep. Daniel went downstairs. Emma was standing by the door, looking at him questioningly. Daniel said the new girl would be helping with the cleaning. Emma nodded. She didn't ask where she was from. She didn't ask why. She'd seen the burns and the hungry eyes, and that was enough for her. For the next 5 days, Sora washed the counter. She did a poor job of it, a very poor job. She didn't know how to hold the rag. She didn't know that the water needed to be changed when it got dirty. She didn't know that shelves are wiped from top to bottom, not the other way around. She didn't know that you had to wring out the soap. Daniel didn't yell. He didn't scold her. He didn't roll his eyes. He showed her, once. Calmly. And then he walked away. Sora watched. She memorized it. And she did it again. A little better. One more time. A little better still. By the third day, she'd learned to wash the countertop without leaving streaks. By the fifth, she was sweeping the floor faster than Daniel. She was stubborn, insanely stubborn. She treated every task as a challenge, like a battle, and she won. On the sixth day, Daniel asked her over dinner what she liked to eat. The four of them were having dinner: Daniel, Emma, Haven, and Sora, at a long table in the utility room. Haven brought the soup, Emma sliced the bread, Sora sat and waited for them to serve her. A princess's habit. She'd always been served by servants. Daniel asked what she liked to eat. Sora froze. Her spoon hovered over the bowl. She stared into the soup and remained silent for a long time. Then she said she didn't know, that she had always been served whatever protocol dictated. Breakfast for a princess, lunch for a princess, dinner for a princess. No one had ever asked what she wanted. She stopped short. She realized she'd said too much. The word princess hung in the air. Haven raised an eyebrow. Emma stopped chewing. Daniel didn't let on. He said that today's soup had mushrooms, that tomorrow's would have chicken, and that if she didn't like mushrooms, she should just say so. Sora lowered her eyes. She quietly said she liked mushrooms, and began to eat. The moment passed. Haven returned to her bowl. Emma continued chewing. Daniel poured some tea. But he could see that Sora was chewing more slowly than usual, and that she was smiling, just a little, at him. Daniel knew she was a princess. He'd known from the very first second. He knew her name, her title, her magic school, and her combat stats from the canon. But he kept quiet, because right now, she didn't need a princess. She needed a girl who mops the floors, eats mushroom soup, and for the first time in her life, decides for herself what she likes. 2 weeks passed. Sora's hands had healed. Haven's ointments worked like a miracle. On the 45th day, Daniel gave Sora a new task: to sort through deliveries, count the goods, and check the quantities against the delivery slip. Sora handled it brilliantly, quickly, accurately, and without mistakes. Her upbringing in the princely household had taught her to work with numbers and documents. She simply didn't realize it was a skill. She thought everyone was capable of doing that. Daniel didn't correct her. On the 48th day, another important event took place. Ari didn't come alone. A boy of about 12 was walking behind her, skinny, red-haired, freckled. He was carrying a bundle of hides on his shoulder, almost as big as he was. Ari placed the hides on the counter: 12 rabbit pelts, 2 fox pelts, 1 wolf pelt. A record. Daniel examined each one. He paid. Then he looked at the boy. Ari said his name was Finn, that he lived alone in the forest, that he had nowhere else to go. Her voice was even. No pleas, no explanations, just facts. This is Finn. He has nowhere to go. Daniel looked at the boy. Finn looked back. His eyes were wary, just like Ari's on the first day, a little animal at the threshold of a strange burrow. Finn wasn't in Daniel's canon, not at all. He was a person the world had created on its own, or whom Patch 2.0 had pushed out of oblivion. Daniel said there was room for a second mattress in the attic, and that if Finn wanted to, he could help Ari with the hunt and unload goods at the shop in the evenings. In exchange for food and a roof over his head. Finn looked at Ari. Ari nodded. Finn nodded. The deal was done, without a word. By the evening of the 48th day, there were already 5 people living in the shop, not counting Daniel. Emma was on the 2nd floor. Haven was in the workshop, where she'd set up a cot for herself because she stayed up late working at the cauldrons. Sora was in the attic. Finn was in the attic next to Sora, separated by a curtain. Ari spent the night in the back room when she came in from the forest and left before dawn. The shop was alive. There were people inside. Everyone was busy with their own tasks. Emma stood by the door. Haven was brewing potions. Sora was counting inventory. Finn was hauling boxes. Ari was bringing in hides. And Daniel stood behind the counter, selling. Exactly what each customer needed. 20 silver coins a day. 30, sometimes 40. The stream of newcomers from the guild never dried up. Everyone left with potions, a map, and a kind word. And everyone told others about it. Orvan's shop. Brackenford. The merchant who knows everything. On the 50th day, Daniel sat at the table that evening and tallied the results of the past month and a half. 412 silver coins in the cash register. 6 people on the team. A steady stream of customers. Contact with the Heroes Guild. And one enemy in the form of the Chamber of Commerce, which had remained silent so far after its first move. The silence was frightening. Velan Court wasn't the kind of man to stop after a single strike. He was preparing. Daniel could sense it. And one more thought kept nagging at him. Ethan Graves, the chosen hero. Daniel hadn't heard from him in over a month. According to canon, by now, Ethan should have completed his first dungeon and received the blessing of the Temple of Light. But canon was changing, and Daniel didn't know where Ethan was now, or if he was even alive. He closed his notebook. He blew out the candle. He lay down on the bed. From downstairs came the steady thud of Havon's mortar. Emma was snoring behind the wall. In the attic, a floorboard creaked under Sora's foot. The shop was falling asleep. Daniel lay in the darkness, listening to the breathing of his little world. And he thought that in 50 days he had done more for the people around him than in 34 years in Seoul. On the 52nd day, Velan Court struck a second blow. In the morning, a cart pulled up to the shop with goods from Gregor Most. Daniel had ordered hemp rope and sacks from him. The cart driver climbed down from the cart. He spread his arms wide. He said that Gregor could no longer deliver goods to Orwin's store. No explanation. He just couldn't. "I'm sorry." Daniel nodded. He let the driver go. He closed the door. He sat down behind the counter. So the chamber had moved on to putting pressure on the suppliers. A classic move. Buy the loyalty of those who supply the shop and cut off the flow. Daniel knew that others would follow Gregor. Penn the glassblower, Will the leather worker, Granny Mora with her red herbs. Each of them was a small-time operator who wouldn't risk a falling out with the Chamber of Commerce over a single shop. By lunchtime, 2 out of 3 had confirmed it. Penn sent a boy with a note. He couldn't fulfill the order for the vials. Sorry. Granny Mora simply didn't show up on the appointed day. She'd never missed a day before. So she must have had a visit too. Only Will was still silent. Daniel sat behind the counter and thought, calmly, like an analyst facing a complex problem. 3 out of 4 suppliers are cut off: ropes, bubbles, and herbs. We can manage without ropes for a while. Without the vials, Haven won't be able to bottle the potions. Without the red herbs, there'll be nothing to brew the potions from. The chamber had struck precisely, right at the heart of the matter. Daniel took out his notebook. He wrote 3 columns: problem, solution, time. Ropes. Find another supplier or buy them at the market in the neighboring town. 1 week. Vials. Find a glassblower outside the chamber's sphere of influence, or come up with alternative containers. 3 days. Herbs. The hardest part. Granny Mora was the only major collector of red herbs in the area. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the workshop door. Behind it, Haven was working on a new batch. In 2 days, she'd run out of red herbs. In 5, the vials would be gone. In a week, the shop would be out of its main product. Daniel closed his eyes. He thought. He opened his eyes. He stood up. He walked over to Ari, who was sitting in the corner mending the strap on her quiver. He asked if she knew where red herbs grew in the forest. Ari looked up. She gave him a long look. She nodded. She knew every bush within a 20-mile radius of Brackenford. Daniel said he needed red herbs, a lot of them, on a regular basis, and that he'd pay a silver coin per sack, twice as much as Granny Mora charged her customers. Ari nodded again. She stood up. She left. That evening she returned with 2 sacks of red herbs, clean, well-dried, harvested properly, with roots and leaves intact. Daniel paid 2 silver pieces. The first problem was solved. Sora helped with the vials. Daniel hadn't expected it. He sat in the back room that evening, listing out loud the options for alternative containers. Clay pots, wooden flasks, leather wineskins. Every option was worse than glass. Haven's potions required airtight, inert containers. Sora was mopping the floor nearby and listening. Then she stopped. She leaned on the mop and said that in Valinor they used fired white clay covered with glaze for potions, cheaper than glass, just as good in terms of properties, and any potter could make it. Daniel turned to her. Sora stood there with a wet mop in her bandaged hands, looking at him calmly, like someone who was used to her knowledge being valued. A princess, a member of the princely house. She'd been taking lectures on alchemy and materials science since she was 10. She just never thought it would come in handy for mopping floors. Daniel thanked her. Sora shrugged. She went back to mopping. The next day, Daniel found a potter on the outskirts of Brackenford, an old man named Colt, a small workshop, white clay, glaze, 10 vials a day. Daniel ordered 100. Colt was surprised but agreed. The chamber didn't bother the potters. They were too small time. The second problem was solved. The ropes turned out to be even easier. Emma suggested riding to Havenmore to get them, a town 2 hours away on horseback. It had its own market, its own chamber. The suppliers didn't answer to Valencourt. Daniel gave Emma some money. She returned by evening with a full cart. The third problem was solved. In 3 days, Daniel had restored all the supply chains, each one via a detour that the chamber didn't control. Gregor Most, Glassblower Penn, Granny Mora. 3 people whom the chamber had used as pawns. Daniel wasn't angry with them. They were small people in a big game. But he remembered. And he knew that Valencourt would remember too. That the shop hadn't gone out of business. That the merchant had found a workaround in 3 days. That would enrage him. And an angry Valencourt is more dangerous than a calm one. On the 56th day, what Daniel had both been waiting for and fearing happened. Ethan Graves walked into the shop. Daniel recognized him at first. The boy had changed. He'd lost weight. He'd grown taller. He was tanned to the point of blackness. On his left arm was a fresh scar running from his elbow to his wrist. His hair had grown out and was tied back with a leather strap. His eyes had grown harder. 2 months of travel and battles. Ethan walked up to the counter. He looked at Daniel. He said he remembered him. That he remembered the headband. That he remembered the advice about the mill. That he hadn't gone to the mill alone. That a week later, he learned from a passing hunter that there were wyverns at the mill, and that if he'd gone alone, he wouldn't be standing here now. Daniel listened. His face was calm. Inside, everything tightened. So it had worked. Ethan was alive because Daniel had said 1 sentence to him on the first day. 1 sentence. 1 shifted point on the scenario line. Ethan hadn't come for potions. He'd come for advice. He sat down on a stool at the counter and began to tell his story. His party was stuck. 3 fighters, a swordsman, an archer, and a mage, a standard guild party. According to canon, they'd cleared the first 3 dungeons without any trouble. But the world had changed. The dungeons had become more difficult. The monsters had adapted. The traps had changed. Ethan's party was stuck on the 2nd dungeon. 3 attempts, 3 failures. The archer was wounded, The mage was burned out. The swordsman was thinking of quitting. Ethan didn't know what to do. Daniel listened and saw the problem from a player's perspective. Ethan's party was balanced for the canonical version of the game. The swordsman was the tank. The archer was a ranged fighter. The mage was support. Ethan was the damage dealer. 4 roles. But in patch 2.0, the second dungeon contained an anti-magic barrier on the 3rd level. The mage became useless. The archer couldn't use enchanted arrows. That left Ethan and the swordsman against the mob. 2 against 20. Failure was guaranteed. Daniel asked if the archer could shoot regular arrows. Ethan said yes, but they didn't do much damage. Daniel asked if the mage had any skills that didn't use mana. Ethan thought for a moment and said the mage could detect traps without magic, a scouting skill. Daniel nodded. He took out a piece of paper. He drew a map of the second dungeon from memory. 9 rooms, 3 levels. He pointed out where the barrier was. He showed where it could be bypassed via the upper corridor, which opens if you press a stone in the wall of the 3rd room. A secret he'd discovered on his 4th run at 3 in the morning when he accidentally clicked the mouse in the wrong place. Ethan looked at the map. His face had the expression of someone who'd just been shown another world. He asked how Daniel knew the layout of the dungeon. Daniel said the hunters talk a lot, the same lie as always. Ethan didn't believe him. It was obvious. But he didn't press the issue. He took the map. He stood up and asked one more question. He asked about the rusty sword, the one he'd sold on the first day. He said he still didn't have a decent weapon, that the guild had issued him a standard blade, but it broke every other fight, and that he sometimes thought about that rusty sword. A strange thought, a silly one probably, but he thought about it. Daniel looked at him. Ethan was standing by the door, skinny, battered, 16 years old, a boy whom the world had designated as a savior. Daniel said the sword was safe, that he'd kept it, and that when the time came, Ethan would get it. But not now. Ethan asked why not now. Daniel replied that the sword wasn't ready yet, and that Ethan wasn't ready yet. Neither of them was. Ethan stood in silence. Then he nodded, turned around, walked out. The bell jingled. Daniel sat down behind the counter and stared at the door for a long time. A map of the dungeon. Advice about the group. A promise to return the sword. 3 threads that now bound him to the chosen hero. Each thread pulled the storyline away from the canon, and each thread made Daniel visible to those who monitored deviations. That evening, he took the blade of the Silent Dawn out of the back room. He unrolled the canvas. The rusty metal glinted dimly in the candlelight. Daniel placed his palm on the blade. It was cold. But beneath the cold, something was pulsing. Quietly, barely perceptibly, like a second heartbeat. The sword was waiting. Daniel wrapped it back up and put it away. Then he jotted it down in his notebook. Day 56. Ethan is back, alive. The group is stuck. He gave us a map of the second dungeon. The storyline has shifted one more step. How many steps are left before someone comes asking questions? On the 58th day, a woman Daniel didn't know walked into the shop. Tall, dark-skinned, silver hair tied in a bun. Her hands bore scorch marks from the blacksmith's fire. A leather apron over a simple shirt. Behind her back, a canvas bag from which the handles of hammers protruded. She stopped at the threshold. She surveyed the shop with the keen gaze of a craftsman who assesses any space by the arrangement of objects. Then she approached the counter and asked if the merchant would take her goods on consignment. She had knives. Daniel looked at her and recognized her. Meyer Shin, a half-blood blacksmith from the Mountain of Hammers. According to canon, she was supposed to be sitting at a story location, waiting for the player to reach her. Here, she had come on her own. Banished from her clan for her non-human blood. Her father was a non-human. Daniel didn't remember exactly what race he was. In the canon, this was revealed later. Meyer took 3 knives out of her bag and placed them on the counter. Daniel picked up the first one. He turned it over in his hand. He examined the blade, the balance, the handle. The knife was superb. The steel was pure. The edge was even. The dark wooden handle was fitted perfectly. Not a single gap. Not a single extra millimeter. The work of a master. Not an apprentice. Not a student. A master with a capital M. Meyer stood and waited. Her face was stony. Her shoulders were tense. She was waiting for his assessment, and she feared it. Her whole life, her work had been judged through the lens of her blood. Good for a half-blood, not bad for a filthy one. It's a wonder their hands even work at all. Daniel set the knife on the counter. He took out a second one, examined it. A third, examined it. All 3 were equally flawless. He looked at Meyer. She stood straight, but Daniel could see her left fingers trembling slightly. He named his price. 2 silver coins per knife. Meyer blinked. The market price for a good knife was 1 silver coin. Only renowned, experienced masters with a hallmark sold them for 1.5. No one paid 2 silver coins. She asked if she'd heard him correctly. Daniel said she hadn't, and he explained. The steel was purer than that used by the Blacksmith's Guild masters. The edge held its angle better than mass-produced blades. The balance was perfect. The handle was hand-fitted, not stamped. It was one-of-a-kind work, and the price for one-of-a-kind work was at least 2 silver coins. He could have taken 1.5. The market wouldn't have noticed the difference. But Daniel didn't trade with the market. He traded with people. And right now, he needed Mir Shin to hear that her work was worth more. Not in spite of who she was, but because of it. Mir stood motionless, staring at the coins Daniel had laid out on the counter. 6 silver coins for 3 knives. She took the money, silently. Then she suddenly said she could make 5 knives a week, if there's a demand. Daniel said there was a demand, and he added that in a month he'd need more than just knives, arrowheads, belt buckles, small hardware, and maybe something more serious. Weapons. Not for sale at the market, for specific people. Meyer looked at him. For the first time during the entire conversation, something had changed in her eyes. Not warmth, not trust. Interest. The professional interest of a craftsman who's been offered not just a job, but a challenging one. She said she'd think about it and left. 3 days later, she returned with 5 knives and a list of what she could make. Daniel read the list and realized he'd found the person who would fill the last gap in his plan. Haven made potions. Ari sourced materials. Emma handled security. Sora kept the records. Finn helped unload supplies. And Meyer would make weapons and tools. A complete cycle. Procurement, processing, production, and storage. Sales. A single shop capable of supplying a squad of heroes with everything they needed, from rope to swords. Daniel offered Meyer a spot in the shop, a workshop in the courtyard. The chamber didn't regulate the blacksmith's yard if it was part of a retail outlet. An old rule from the Artisan's Codex. Daniel knew it because he'd read the codex in the game on his 7th playthrough while looking for a loophole for a side quest. Meyer agreed. Not right away, a day later. She arrived in the morning with her tools, hammers, pliers, chisels, a set of files, and a small portable anvil that she'd hauled on her back 40 miles from Mount Hammers. Emma helped set up the yard. They put up a shed. They paved the area for the forge with stones. Finn hauled in coal. By evening, Meyer was already standing at the anvil, striking the red-hot metal. The ringing echoed down the street. Neighbors peered out. Tom the baker shook his head. Martha, the blacksmith's wife, pursed her lips. Brackenford already had a blacksmith, old Berg. He forged horseshoes and staples and didn't like competition. Daniel knew Berg would go and complain, and he knew to whom. The chamber, another lever for Valon Court. But Meyer was doing different work, delicate, custom-made, knives, pins, hardware. Berg forged rough iron. Meyer forged art. There was minimal overlap. The chamber would find no grounds for a ban unless she began to blatantly break the law. And Valon Court, for all his harshness, always acted within the rules. That was his strength and his weakness. On the 62nd day, Daniel gathered everyone around a single table for dinner for the first time. A long table in the utility room. 7 seats. Daniel in the center, Emma on the right, Havon on the left, Sora next to Havon, Ari in the corner, as always, Meyer across from them. Finn sat between Ari and Meyer. Emma brought the bread and cheese. Havon had made herbal soup. Sora volunteered to help and nearly dropped the pot. Meyer smiled. Finn chewed in silence. Ari ate quickly, as usual. Her eyes darted around the room, the habit of a small animal always looking for a way out. It was quiet. Spoons clattered. The soup sloshed in the bowls. It was getting dark outside the window. Daniel walked along the table and placed a small something in front of each person. In front of Ari was a meat pie. She loved meat more than anything. Daniel had noticed this 3 weeks after she'd been staring at the butcher's display across the way. In front of Havon was a new vial, made of white glazed clay. The first from Potter Colt's batch, perfect for her potions. In front of Emma was a whetstone. Not just any whetstone, from the Silver Dawn, her former order. Daniel had found it at a junk dealer's in Havenmore. He recognized it by the star-shaped mark. He bought it for 4 silver coins. Emma picked up the stone. She ran her finger over the mark. She froze. Her expression didn't change, but her finger traced the mark again and again. In front of Sora was a wooden spoon, a simple one, made of ash wood. 2 hieroglyphs were carved on the handle. S.K. Her initials. Daniel had carved them himself, over 3 evenings with a pocket knife. Crooked, but legible. Sora picked up the spoon. She turned it over. She saw the letters. She looked at Daniel. She opened her mouth. She closed it. She took the spoon in both hands and pressed it to her chest. In front of Meyer stood a bottle, hand oil for burns. Havon had brewed it at Daniel's request 3 days ago, a special recipe. Meyer opened the bottle. She sniffed it. She rubbed some onto her palm. The skin on her fingers was rough and cracked from the heat. The oil soaked in instantly. Meyer clenched and unclenched her fist. She looked at her hand and muttered that it wasn't bad. For Meyer, that was tantamount to delight. A quill lay in front of Finn, a real writing quill made from a goose's wing, with a copper nib. Daniel had bought it from a scribe for a silver coin. Finn looked at the quill but didn't touch it. Daniel knew why. Finn didn't know how to write. No one had taught him. But the quill lay before him. The first thing anyone had ever given him. Just like that. Finn reached out. He took the quill, clenched it in his fist, tightly, as if he were afraid someone would take it away. No one said a word. Everyone just sat there and ate. Outside the window, the first autumn rain was falling. Drops tapped against the shutters. It was warm inside the shop. It smelled of soup and mint tea. 7 people at one table. None of them had been here a month ago. None of them had a home a month ago. Daniel sat at the head of the table and looked at them. At Ari, who was chewing a pastry with her eyes closed. At Havon, who was twirling a bottle between her fingers and smiling. At Emma, who was stroking a whetstone. At Sora, with a spoon pressed to her chest. At Meyer, who was massaging her hands with oil. At Finn, who was clutching a quill. Small things. Each cost less than 10 silver coins. Each was made or found for a specific person. This was his true trade, not merchandise in general. Merchandise for you. Precise. Personal. Seen. The rain was pattering down. Candles were burning. The shop exuded warmth. Daniel took a sip of mint tea and thought that for the sake of this evening, it had been worth waking up in a stranger's body. Outside the window, in the darkness of the rain, stood a man. He had been standing there for a long time, motionless, in a hooded cloak. He was looking at the lit window of the cafe. Then he pulled a small notebook from his coat pocket. He wrote something down, put the notebook away, and left, silently, through the puddles, into the darkness. Daniel didn't see this. No one did. On the 65th day, the observer came again. This time, Ari noticed him. She had returned from the woods at dawn and saw a figure in a dark raincoat by the well across from the shop. The figure stood motionless, staring at the sign, then turned and walked down the alley. Ari watched until the end of the street. The figure vanished, as if it had dissolved into thin air. She told Daniel about it, briefly, without emotion. A man in a cloak. He stood there. He looked. He left. He vanished. Daniel listened and felt a chill spread through him. The script guardians. The keepers of the canon. In the game, they were a mysterious faction that appeared in secret quests. 3 NPCs in gray hooded cloaks. They would appear when a player did something that disrupted the storyline too much. In the canon, they were harmless. They warned. They threatened. They vanished. But this was patch 2.0, the living world. And the story guardians in the living world could be anything. Daniel didn't panic. He jotted down everything he knew about the guardians from the canon in his notebook. 3 agents, gray cloaks. The ability to sense deviations from the storyline. Not tied to any cities. They move freely. Purpose unknown. In the game, they were guardians of order. He didn't know what they were here for, but they were watching. So Daniel had shifted the line enough to attract their attention. He closed his notebook and decided not to do anything for now, to watch, just as they were watching him. On the 67th day, a courier from the Heroes Guild arrived at the shop. A sealed envelope with a silver sword brooch stamped in wax. Daniel opened it. Inside was a contract, an official one. Orwin Talbot's shop was designated as the Heroes Guild's supply point in the Brackenford sector. Minimum supply quantities. Healing potions, 20 per month. Mana restoration potions, 10. Bandages, torches, ropes, dry rations. Payment at a fixed rate, 10% above market value, plus protected status. An attack on a guild supply point was considered an attack on the guild itself. Daniel read the contract and his hands trembled, not from nervousness, from relief. Protected status. Velon Court wouldn't be able to openly touch the shop as long as this contract was in effect. Arson, robbery, damage to merchandise, all of this became a crime against the guild, and not even the Chamber of Commerce dared to argue with the Heroes Guild. Daniel signed the contract. He gave a copy to the courier. He hid his own copy in the safe that Emma had installed in the back room last week. And for the first time in 2 weeks, he breathed a sigh of relief. That evening, he told the team. Everyone gathered in the back room. Daniel announced that the shop was now an official supply point for the Heroes Guild. That meant a steady income, steady orders, and protection. Haven asked if she could handle an order of 20 healing potions a month. Daniel said she could, and that he'd raise her pay. Haven adjusted her glasses and said she didn't need a raise. She needed a second cauldron. Daniel nodded. Meyer said she could forge arrowheads if the guild would purchase them. Daniel said he'd propose this at the next meeting with the inspector. Emma said they needed to replace the locks on all the doors and windows. Contract or no contract, safety comes first. Daniel nodded again. Sora listened in silence. Then she asked if the accounting system needed to be updated to the guild's new reporting format. Everyone turned to her. Sora stood up straight. Her face was calm. Her eyes were serious. She asked as if it were the most natural question in the world. Daniel looked at her and realized that Princess Valinor knew about the Heroes Guild's bureaucracy, which meant that in her past life she had dealt with such documents. He said yes, update it. And he added that Sora was now in charge of all the shop's paperwork. Sora nodded, expressionless, but Daniel noticed how she straightened up slightly, lifted her chin just a little. She had been given responsibility. Real responsibility, not mopping floors, not wiping down the counter. A job that required her brain. For the first time in this shop, she was needed not for her hands, but for her mind. On the 70th day, Daniel received a letter. Not from the guild, not from the chamber. The letter was lying on the threshold that morning. Unsigned, unsealed. A single sheet of paper. 4 words were written on it. We know who you are. Daniel stood by the door and looked at the paper. Then he folded it. He put it in his pocket. He walked behind the counter. He opened the shop. He began his usual day. His hands didn't tremble. His mind was working. Who? The chamber wouldn't write notes. The chamber operated through officials and paperwork. The guild wouldn't threaten its supplier. The cult of the Abyss didn't know about him, for now. That left the scenario guard. We know who you are. Not what you do, not what you sell. Who you are. They knew he wasn't Orvan, or at least suspected it. 4 words. The first direct contact. Daniel worked all day as usual. He sold potions, drawing maps, smiling at customers. But inside he was thinking, if the guard knew who he was, why hadn't they come? Why a note instead of a visit? Why a warning instead of action? In the canon, the guardians acted gently. They warned. They gave a chance to stop. But if the anomaly continued to grow, they came and erased it. Silently, cleanly, as if the anomaly had never existed. Daniel didn't know if this pattern worked in patch 2.0, but he knew one thing. He couldn't stop. The shop was growing. People depended on it. Haven brewed potions. Meyer forged knives. Emma stood at the door. Ari brought in hides and herbs. Sora kept the books. Finn was learning to read. In the evenings, Daniel sat with him at the table and traced the pen across the paper. A, B, C. Finn frowned and repeated them. 13 years without a single letter. But he was stubborn. A week later, he knew the alphabet. 2 weeks later, he was writing his name. Crooked, slowly, but on his own. To stop meant giving it up. It meant slipping back into the role of Orvan, the quiet NPC who sells candles and asks no questions. Daniel couldn't do that. He didn't want to. He put the note away in his desk drawer and went back to work. On the 73rd day, Lena Park arrived. No, Emma brought Lena. That evening, after her shift, Emma brought the girl over. Thin, pale, 16 years old, 2 short pigtails, glasses on her nose. In her hands, a worn notebook that she clutched to her chest like a shield. Emma said she'd found her at the orphanage, that the orphanage was closing, that the children were being placed with families, that no one would take Lena because she was too old to be adopted and too skinny to work on a farm. Lena stood silently. She stared at the floor, the notebook pressed against her chest. Daniel looked at her. Lena Park. She wasn't in the canon, not at all, just like Finn. The world created people. Patch 2.0 filled Ayrton with lives that hadn't existed before. New people, new destinies, new pains. He asked Lena what was in the notebook. Lena raised her head. Her eyes behind her glasses were large and wary. She opened the notebook. Daniel looked inside. Neat handwriting, straight lines, columns of numbers, tables. Lena kept the shelter's accounts, on her own, without being asked. Without being told to, simply because she saw that no one else was doing it, so she started. Income, expenses, food supplies, number of children, everything, for 2 years. Daniel flipped through the notebook and felt a lump form in his throat. A 16-year-old orphan was handling the accounting for an entire orphanage at a level that would have made half the analysts at his former company in Seoul blush. He closed the notebook. He looked at Lena. He said she needed a job. Lena nodded, quickly, sharply, like someone afraid the offer would disappear if she didn't accept immediately. Daniel said he'd pay 3 silver coins a week, food, a room, and an education, every evening, math, reading, logistics. Lena blinked. Education? No one had ever offered her an education. Orphans don't go to school. Orphans work. She opened her mouth, closed it, nodded again. And that was it. From that day on, there were 8 people in the shop. Daniel, Emma, Havan, Ari, Sora, Myre, Finn, Lena. Crowded, noisy, lively. The shop was alive with people. And every evening, when everyone had dispersed to their rooms, attics, and workshops, Daniel would sit down alone behind the counter and write in his notebook. Day 73. 8 people. The contract with the guild. A note from the guard. The chamber is preparing its 3rd move. The cannon is 40% destroyed. He closed the notebook. He blew out the candle, and in the darkness of the shop, he heard a faint sound. From the back room, where the blade lay. The sound was like a hum, low, barely audible, as if the metal were singing in its sleep. Daniel listened closely. The sound faded. He went to bed, but he couldn't fall asleep for a long time. The sword was singing. For the first time in over 2 months, something was changing. On the 78th day, Valancourt came in person. Daniel was standing behind the counter when a man of about 45 walked through the door. An impeccable dark blue doublet, silver buttons, hair slicked back, a smooth, well-groomed face with thin lips and calm gray eyes. He moved slowly, confidently, like a man who owns the room he's entering. Behind him walked 2 assistants in gray frock coats, the same ones who had come the first time. Valon stopped in the middle of the shop. He looked around. He looked at the shelves, at the price tags, at the white glazed clay jars, at the sign with the hours of operation, at Emma by the door, at Daniel behind the counter, and he smiled. Politely, warmly, like an old acquaintance. He said he was glad to finally meet in person, that he'd heard a lot about Orwin Talbot's shop, that he was impressed, truly impressed. In just 3 months, this small shop in Brackenford had become one of the most talked-about places on the Western Trail. That deserved respect. Daniel listened. His face was calm. His hands rested on the counter. He knew Valancourt. 11 playthroughs, every dialogue, every move. Valon never came to yell, never threatened directly. He smiled, he praised, and he slashed with a knife under the table. Valon walked up to the counter. He placed a business card on it. Embossed paper, gold lettering, Master Valancourt, head of the Chamber of Commerce for the Western Lands. Then he said he'd come with a proposal. The Chamber wants to incorporate Orvin's shop into its retail network, under special terms. Privileged partner status. Discounts on wholesale purchases through the Chamber's approved suppliers. Access to rare goods. Legal protection. and the chamber's recommendations to clients from the upper classes. In exchange, the shop would adopt the chamber's pricing structure. The product lineup would be coordinated with the regional coordinator. Reports are submitted monthly, and 10% of revenue goes to the chamber's fund. Daniel listened, every word. The offer sounded generous. For any merchant in the Western lands, it would be a dream come true. A privileged partner of the chamber. Protection, resources, status. But Daniel saw what an ordinary merchant would not have seen. The chamber's pricing meant he couldn't set his own prices. Product selection meant the chamber decided what he would sell. Reporting meant that Velen saw every transaction. 10% of revenue meant control. This wasn't an offer. It was a leash. A beautiful one, golden, studded with diamonds, but a leash nonetheless. Daniel looked at Velen. Velen was smiling, waiting. Calmly, Daniel said he was grateful for the offer, that he understood its value, and that he needed a week to think it over. Velen nodded. He said a week was a reasonable amount of time. He wished him a good day and left. His assistants followed him out. The door closed. Emma looked at Daniel. He was standing behind the counter, staring at the business card. Then he put it away in a drawer. Next to the note from the Guardians. 2 enemies, 2 sources of pressure, from different sides. That evening he gathered the team. He told them about the chamber's proposal. Everyone listened. Haven was the first to ask what assortment approval meant. Daniel explained. The chamber decides which potions to sell and at what price. Haven took off her glasses. She wiped them. She put them back on. She said that if anyone tried to tell her which potions to brew, she'd walk out. Calmly, without raising her voice. Just a statement of fact. Meyer said that the chamber doesn't know the difference between her knives and mass-produced items from a workshop in the capital, and that if they start evaluating her work based on their own standards, she'll leave too. Emma said that the contract with the Heroes Guild offers protection no worse than that of the chamber, and that there's no point in trading one patron for another. Sora was silent. Then she said she'd looked over the financial terms. That 10% of revenue, at their current turnover, amounts to 40 silver coins a month, and that with that money they could hire a second security guard and a courier and provide for themselves what the chamber offers. Daniel listened, every voice, every argument, and he understood that the decision had already been made. Not them, by them. The shop didn't want to be led by the nose. He said he would refuse. Everyone nodded. Ari didn't nod. She had been silent the entire evening, but when everyone had left, she approached Daniel and quietly said one word. Careful. Daniel nodded. 4 days later, he sent the court of Valana a polite refusal, via courier, in writing. He thanked them for the offer. He explained that the workshop preferred to remain independent. He wished the chamber success. Nothing happened the next day, nor the day after that. And for 3 more days, silence. Daniel knew this wasn't the end. It was a pause before the next move. Valan Court had received the refusal and was now thinking, calculating. He was looking for a weak spot. On the 83rd day, Daniel went out in the morning to open the shop and caught a scent. Burnt wood. He walked around the building, the back wall. At the base, a charred spot the size of a palm. Someone had held a flame to the wall during the night. The wood hadn't caught fire. The wall was damp from the rain. Coincidence or deliberate? The arsonist either wanted to burn it down or wanted to scare someone. Daniel stood by the charred wall and thought, if this was the chamber, then Valan had gone from pressure to threats. If it was an accident, then he's paranoid. He called Emma. She examined the wall. She looked around the ground. She found footprints. One person, lightweight, wearing soft shoes, came from the direction of the alley. He left the same way. Not a professional, A professional doesn't leave footprints or set fire to a wet wall. Daniel went back to the shop. He wrote it down in his notebook. Day 83, an attempted arson, or a warning. The perpetrator was unknown. The chamber, or the guard, or a third force. Night security was needed. He hired Ari, not as a security guard, as a watcher. Ari knew better than anyone how to move in the dark and how to see those who didn't want to be seen. He paid her 1 silver coin per night. Ari nodded. Starting that night, she slept during the day in the back room and sat on the roof of the shop at night. Quiet, invisible, wearing her new boots that didn't squeak. A week passed. The arsonist hadn't returned. Every morning, Ari gave a brief report. No one. Clear. Daniel didn't let his guard down. He knew that Valan's third move hadn't been made yet. The arson attempt could have been a reconnaissance mission, a test of their reaction, and the real strike was yet to come. On the 88th day, Ethan sent a letter. It was short, written in a scrawled hand, like someone writing by a campfire in the woods. He had cleared the second dungeon. The secret passage had worked. The group was alive. The archer had recovered. The mage had found a new role. The swordsman had stayed behind. They were heading north, toward the third dungeon, and Ethan asked if he could stop by the shop on his way back. In about a month. Daniel read the letter 3 times. Then he folded it up and put it away. Ethan was heading north, toward the third dungeon. According to the canon, the first serious boss was waiting there, the Night Shadow, a high-rank undead, the very type of undead that must be killed to activate the Blade of the Silent Dawn. The condition for recognition: to single-handedly defeat a high-rank undead at sunset. Daniel sat behind the counter, staring at the wall. If Ethan kills the Night Shadow at sunset, the condition will be met. But Ethan doesn't have the blade. The blade is here, in the back room, under the canvas, the one that sings at night. Everything's quiet for now. Everything seems under control. But Daniel felt the threads tightening. The chamber on the left, the guards on the right, Ethan ahead, the blade downstairs. And every day, the gap between canon and reality grew wider. 90 days, 3 months in Airtan. Daniel closed the shop that evening. He checked the locks. He checked the windows. He went upstairs. He lay down on the bed. A quiet hum came from the back room again. The blade was singing, louder than before, as if it sensed that Ethan was heading toward his trial, as if it were calling out. Daniel lay there and listened. And for the first time, he wondered what would happen when Ethan returned and asked for the sword. To give it or not to give it? A question that would determine everything. He closed his eyes. He didn't have an answer yet. On the 92nd day, Valan Court struck a real blow. Not against the shop, against the people. That morning, Havon came to the workshop and discovered that the 3 sacks of dried red herbs Ari had brought the day before were gone. The workshop door was locked. The window was shut from the inside. The herbs had simply vanished. Havon stood in the middle of the workshop, staring at the empty shelf. Her face was pale. Her hands were clenched. She didn't scream. She didn't curse. She just stood there. And Daniel saw that familiar fear rising in her eyes. The fear that everything would come crashing down, that she'd be left alone again with an empty cauldron. Imposter syndrome was gnawing at her. Daniel surveyed the workshop. The lock was intact. The window was intact. No signs of forced entry. That meant only one thing. Someone had entered with a key. Or without a key, but with a skill that leaves no traces. He called Emma. Emma checked all the doors, all the windows, all the cracks. Nothing. Then Ari came in. She walked silently through the workshop, She sniffed the air, crouched down by the door, ran her finger along the threshold, stood up, said one word. Magic. Someone had opened the lock with magic, not forced it open, opened it, cleanly, neatly, professionally. Daniel sat down at the counter and thought. The chamber didn't use magic. The chamber operated through people and paperwork. A magical break-in was a whole other level, a different player. The cult of the abyss. Or the Guardians. Or a fourth party Daniel didn't know about. He took out his notebook. He reread his notes. A note from the Guardians. We know who you are. An arson attempt. Now the theft of herbs. 3 incidents. 3 different handwritings. The note was a warning. The arson was crude. The theft was clean. 3 different hands. Daniel began to understand. He was being pressured by not 1, not 2, but at least 3 forces. The chamber wanted control, the Guardians wanted order, and a third party wanted the blade. The cult of the abyss. They knew about the sword. How they knew was unknown, but they knew. And the theft of the herbs wasn't the goal. It was a test, a reconnaissance mission. They were testing whether they could infiltrate the shop unnoticed. Next time, they wouldn't come for the herbs. Daniel closed his notebook. He stood up. He walked over to the back room. He opened the door. The blade was lying on the workbench under a canvas cover, right where it belonged. Untouched. He exhaled. Then he made a decision. That evening he gathered his team. He told them everything. Not everything, but enough. He said that several forces were putting pressure on the shop, that one of them was using magic, that there was a valuable item in his back room that they might try to steal. He didn't say what it was. He didn't say why. Just a valuable item. Emma asked how valuable. Daniel paused and said that this item could decide the outcome of the war with Archdemon. Silence. Everyone was looking at him. Haven took off her glasses. Meyer stopped sharpening her knife. Sora froze with her notebook in her hands. Ari watched from the corner, motionless. Finn sat on the floor, clutching his quill. Lena carefully closed her ledger. Emma was the first to break the silence. She asked what they should do. Daniel said they needed to hide the item, move it from the storeroom to a place that magic cannot penetrate. Sora suddenly raised her hand. Everyone turned to her. She said that in Valinor, lead boxes were used to store magical artifacts. Lead blocks magical detection, completely. If the item is in a lead box, no seeker will find it. Silence again. Daniel looked at Sora. She stood upright, calm, like someone stating the obvious. The sorceress princess. The knowledge she considered commonplace was priceless. Daniel turned to Meyer. He asked if she could make a lead box. Meyer said she could, in 2 days. Daniel nodded. 2 days later, Meyer brought the box. Made of lead, heavy, with a hinged lid and a lock. Simple, rough, functional. That night, Daniel carried the blade by himself. He wrapped it in canvas, placed it in the box, closed it, locked it. He buried the box under the floor of Meyer's workshop, under the anvil, where a fire burned constantly and metal clanged. The perfect cover. Even if someone sensed a residual magical trace from the sword, the heat of the forge and the clang of iron would completely drown it out. Daniel buried the box. He tamped down the earth. Meyer put the anvil back in place. She looked at him. She didn't ask anything. She just nodded. The next 5 days were spent in tension. Daniel waited for a countermove from any of his 3 opponents, the chamber, the guard, the cult. On the 97th day, the cult responded. That night, Ari saw 3 figures on the roof. They were walking down the alley toward the back door of the shop. Dark cloaks, hoods. Their hands glowed with a dim purple light. Abyss magic. Ari didn't wait. She whistled the code signal. One short whistle, two long ones. Emma burst out the door with her sword. Meyer came out of the workshop with her hammer. The three figures in cloaks stopped. They hadn't expected resistance. They'd expected an empty shop and a sleeping merchant. Instead, standing before them were a paladin with her blade at the ready and a blacksmith with a warhammer. And on the roof sat a hunter with a bow, invisible in the darkness. The three exchanged glances. The violet light on their hands faded. They turned and left, quickly, silently, without a fight. Emma wanted to give chase. Daniel said no. There was no need. They'd be back. But now they knew the shop wasn't defenseless, and next time they'd send more. That bought them time. A little. Daniel sat up until morning thinking. The cult of the Abyss knew about Clink. They'd come for him. They'd be back. And when they returned, 3 fighters wouldn't be enough. He needed help. Real help. On the 98th day, he wrote 2 letters. The first to Ray Cullen, inspector of the Guild of Heroes. He reported that the guild's supply point had been attacked, that the attackers had used the magic of the Abyss, that the shop needed reinforced protection. He wrote the second letter to Ethan Graves, a short one, 4 words. Come back. I have news. He sent both by the morning courier. Then he sat down behind the counter. He looked at his hands. The hands of a merchant. Not a fighter. Not a mage. Not a hero. A merchant who sells potions and draws maps, and who, for some reason, had found himself in the middle of a war that someone else was supposed to be fighting. On the 99th day, a reply came from the guild. Ray Cullen personally arrived in Brackenford with a squad of 4 fighters. He inspected the shop. He listened to Daniel. He listened to Emma. He listened to Ari. He nodded. He left 2 fighters on guard at the shop. He said that an attack on a guild supply point was a serious matter, that he would report it to his superiors. And he left. 2 guild fighters stood by the door, next to Emma. The shop now looked like a small fortress, a trading post with 3 warriors at the entrance. Customers came in and glanced at the swords, but they bought potions, picked up maps, and left, saying that in Brackenford, Orvin's shop was now under the guild's protection. Its reputation was growing. The 100th day, 3 months and 10 days in Ayrton. Daniel stood behind the counter and looked out the window. He was waiting for a reply from Ethan, waiting for the Chamber's next move, waiting for the cult's return, waiting for the guard. 4 directions, 4 threats, and 1 shop in the center. Ethan arrived on the 105th day, not alone. His group was with him. A swordsman named Carl, tall, rocky, silent, with a scar across his entire forehead. Nora, the archer, slender, quick, with watchful green eyes. And Oswy, the mage, a short guy in a worn robe with a book under his arm. The 4 of them entered the shop and filled it completely. It smelled of the road, dust, sweat, blood. Ethan had lost even more weight. His cheekbones were sharp, his eyes were sunken, but there was something new in them. Confidence, or the beginning of confidence, a shadow of who he would become. He sat down on a stool by the counter. His group scattered around the shop. Carl leaned against the wall. Nora crouched on a crate. Oswy sat on the floor, opened a book, and began to read. A habit, an automatic one. Ethan looked at Daniel and said he'd received a letter, that it had arrived, and that he had news too. The 3rd dungeon had been cleared. The Shadow Knight had been defeated. Daniel froze. The Shadow Knight had been defeated? A high-rank undead. Destroyed. He asked when. Ethan said 12 days ago, in the evening, at sunset. Daniel felt the floor sway beneath his feet. At sunset. To single-handedly defeat a high-ranking undead at sunset. The condition for recognition by the blade of the quiet dawn. Ethan had fulfilled it. Without the blade. Without even knowing the condition existed. Simply because the battle dragged on into the evening and the final blow came at sunset. A coincidence? Or perhaps not. Daniel remembered how the blade would hum at night, how the metal would sing beneath the canvas. The sword knew. It sensed from a distance that its owner was approaching the moment. And it sang to him. Across hundreds of miles, through the walls of the lead box. Ethan continued speaking. He said that after the Shadow Night, the group had headed south, that along the way they'd encountered refugees from the border villages. The archdemon of the north was moving faster than anyone had thought. His army of the undead had already passed Black Pass. In a month, it would be at Silverhold, the largest city on the border. If Silverhold fell, the path south would be open, and then the war would come here, to Brackenford, to every city in the western lands. Daniel listened. According to canon, the fall of Silverhold took place on the 130th day. 25 days. They had 25 days. He asked Ethan what he planned to do. Ethan said that the guild was sending reinforcements to Silverhold, that his group was going with them, that the battle would be fierce, and that they needed supplies, potions, bandages, weapons, food for the road. Everything the shop could provide. Daniel nodded. Then he said, "Wait." He went into the back room. He returned a minute later. In his hands was a list, a long one, 2 pages. He'd compiled it 3 weeks ago. A list of supplies for the defense of Silverhold. Every item was accounted for. Healing potions, 100. Cold resistance potions, 50. The archdemon of the north used ice magic. Bandages, long-burning torches, 5 days' worth of rations, ropes for barricades, arrowheads made of mire steel, leather belts and bandages, maps of the mountain passes around Silverhold, drawn by hand from memory after 11 traversals. And on a separate line, anti-magic potions, a recipe unknown to anyone in the western lands, except for Haven, because the recipe came from the restricted archives of the V-Land school, and because Daniel had dictated it to her from memory a week ago, saying he'd found it in an old book at the market. Ethan read the list. His eyes widened with every line. He looked up. He looked at Daniel and asked quietly, "Who are you? Not a merchant." "Who are you, really?" Daniel looked at him, at the 16-year-old boy who had killed the Shadow Knight at sunset, who was going to defend the city from an army of the undead, who was asking a merchant who he was. Daniel told the truth, part of it. "I'm a man who knows things, who sees what's to come. Not everything, not always, but enough to help. And I want to help. That's all you need to know." Ethan looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded. Not because he believed him, because he trusted him. 2 months ago, this merchant had saved his life with a single remark about a mill. Then he'd given him a map of the dungeon. Then he'd supplied him with the best potions on the western route. That trust had been earned, not with words, but by deeds. Daniel said it would take 10 days to prepare the order. Ethan said they had 12. The guild was gathering its forces. They'd be leaving in 12 days. Daniel nodded and turned to the team. 10 days. Let's get started. The shop turned into a military factory. Haven didn't leave the workshop. 2 cauldrons worked around the clock. Finn hauled water and firewood. Ari would head into the forest at dawn and return with sacks of herbs at sunset. Meyer forged arrowheads day and night. The clang of the hammer didn't stop until midnight. Emma coordinated the workflow. Who goes where, what comes from where. Sora sat at a table and kept track of every vial, every bandage, every arrow. Lena helped out everywhere. She ran back and forth between the workshop and the shop. She counted, she wrote things down, she packed. Daniel stood in the center and directed everything, like a conductor, like a general without a sword, like a quartermaster on the brink of war. On the third day, help arrived from an unexpected source. Widow Kren from the infirmary at the Church of the Light, the very same woman to whom Daniel had sold flax at cost 3 months earlier. She brought 4 women from the parish. They came to roll bandages, for free, because Orwin had helped when he could have chosen not to. On the 5th day, Tom the baker brought 5 sacks of hardtack. For the army, he said. For the road. He didn't take any money. On the 7th day, old Berg the blacksmith, the very one with whom Meyer had been a competitor, came and stood silently beside her at the anvil. The 2 blacksmiths forged spearheads side by side. Berg's were rough. Meyer's were delicate. Together, they worked faster. The town pitched in, not because anyone ordered them to, because the shop had been helping the town for 3 months, and the town remembered. Daniel stood behind the counter and watched as people came and went, carrying bandages, carrying food, carrying ropes. The small roadside town was preparing for war, and at the center of these preparations was a dusty shop with a sign on which a polka-dot apron hanging on a hook had become something of a banner. On the 115th day, the convoy left Brackenford. 3 wagons, loaded to the brim. Potions in glazed vials packed into straw crates, bandages in oiled sacks, arrowheads in canvas bundles, rations, torches, ropes, maps. Everything was labeled. Everything was numbered. Everything was in place. A detachment from the Heroes Guild marched alongside the convoy. 20 fighters. Ethan led the way with his group. Ray Cullen brought up the rear. Daniel stood at the city gates and watched as the supply train headed down the northern road. The whole team stood nearby. Emma, Havon, Ari, Sora, Meyer, Finn, Lena. 7 people. They were silent. They watched. When the last wagon disappeared behind the hill, Daniel turned and said they needed to prepare the second batch. Everyone looked at him. He explained. Silverhold wouldn't hold out. He knew this from the cannon. The city would fall. Not right away. On the 3rd day of the siege, the garrison would retreat south through the mountain pass, wounded, hungry, without supplies. And they would need all the same things, all over again, even more. Havon took off her glasses. She wiped them. She said she had enough herbs left for 30 potions. Daniel said that Ari already knew where to gather more. Meyer said the anvil hadn't cooled down for 10 days and she needed a break. Daniel said the break would be 1 day. Then they'd start again. Sora said the budget was running out. Daniel said that this time they weren't selling anything. They were giving it away for free. Sora opened her mouth, then closed it. She looked at her notebook full of numbers, then at Daniel, and she nodded. For the next 12 days, the shop ran itself into the ground. Again. But now it was easier. The town pitched in. Mrs. Kren organized a collection of fabric for bandages. Tom the baker baked crackers every day. Even Martha, the blacksmith's wife, who had initially given Meyer the cold shoulder, came to help with the packing. Brackenford was preparing for something it had never seen before, a flood of refugees and wounded from the north. Daniel knew the flood was coming, and he knew when. On the 128th day, give or take 3 days due to discrepancies with the cannon, he was preparing the town, quietly, without panic. Through Emma, he organized a militia. Through Sora, he drew up a plan for housing the wounded. The Church of Light, taverns, barns, any building that could serve as a temporary infirmary. Through Havon, he prepared a supply of potions. Through Meyer, a supply of tools for field repairs. Through Ari, a network of lookouts on the northern approaches. 5 hunters she trusted. They took turns on watch in the hills and kept an eye on the road. On the 125th day, Ari came running from the north. Smoke on the horizon. A lot of smoke. Silverhold was burning. 3 days earlier than Daniel had expected. Cannon was racing against the clock. Daniel didn't wait. He did something no merchant in the history of Ayrton had ever done. He took a second shipment of supplies. He loaded 2 carts and set out to meet the retreating army. Alone. Emma by his side with her sword. Meyer with her hammer. Ari rode ahead on horseback as a scout. Haven rode in a wagon with a cauldron of potions she was finishing brewing right on the move. Sora stayed at the shop. She was in charge. Lina kept track of the accounts. Finn ran errands. The shop ran without Daniel, for the first time. And it ran well, because everyone knew their place. They encountered the first refugees halfway through the day's journey. Peasants, women with children, old people. They were walking, without food, without water. Some were wounded. Daniel stopped the wagon. He unfolded the awning. He set up a table. He laid out the supplies, and he hung up a sign, the same words that Lina would write a few days later in beautiful calligraphic handwriting on a real sign. Orvin's General Store. Free. Take as much as you need. Return it later. People came up. They took bread. They took water. They took bandages. Haven bandaged the wounded. Emma helped those who couldn't walk. Meyer repaired broken wagon axles right on the side of the road. Ari disappeared and returned an hour later with 5 rabbits, food for the campfire. Daniel stood behind a makeshift counter and handed things out. Potions, food, water, words. Go that way. It's safe there. They'll take you in at Brackenford. The Church of Light. The tavern. Say it's from Orwin. By evening, soldiers had arrived. The Silverhold garrison. Broken, battered, but alive. Among them were guild fighters. Among them was Ray Cullen with his head bandaged. And walking among them was Ethan Graves. Daniel saw him from afar. Ethan was walking last, the rear guard, just as a hero should walk, barely. His right arm hung limply. His leather armor was slashed from shoulder to waist. His eyes were glassy with fatigue. But he walked on, and his people followed him. Carl with a shattered shield, Nora with an empty quiver, Oswey without a book for the first time. They reached the awning. Ethan saw Daniel. He saw the counter. He saw the sign. He stopped. He stared. Then his knees buckled, and he sat down right in the road dust. Daniel stepped out from behind the counter. He crouched down beside him. He held out a water flask. Ethan took it. He drank for a long time. Then he set the flask down and said quietly, I couldn't do it. The city has fallen. Archdemon is stronger than anyone thought. I have no weapons, no strength, nothing. Daniel was silent. Then he put his hand on Ethan's shoulder and said, You have us. Ethan lifted his head. He looked at Daniel, at Emma, who was helping the wounded, at Haven, who was bandaging a soldier, at Meyer, who was repairing someone's sword, at Ari, who was silently handing out food, at the small field bench in the middle of the road. And for the first time all day, something changed in his expression. Not hope, not yet, but a glimmer of hope. For the next 3 days, Daniel didn't sleep at all. Brackenford took in 400 refugees and 200 wounded soldiers. The Church of Light was packed. Both taverns were overflowing. People were lying in barns, stables, and haylofts. Haven worked non-stop. They ran out of potions on the 2nd day. She switched to ointments and decoctions, simpler. Less potent, but at least it was something. Meyer forged crutches, splints, braces, anything that would hold broken bones in place. Emma organized patrols. Order in the town, with 400 extra mouths to feed, could collapse at any moment. Sora kept track of the wounded. Name, wound, status, priority for treatment. Lists that saved lives, because without them, Haven would have been running blindly between the infirmaries. Lena counted the food. How much was left? How many days it would last? When the bread would run out? When the meat would run out? When everything would run out? Ari hunted, every day, from dawn to dusk. She brought back meat, rabbits, deer, birds, and fed the town. Finn helped her. In 3 months, the boy had grown and grown stronger. He ran through the woods just as well as an adult. Daniel stood at the center of it all and coordinated everything. Who goes where? What comes from where? How much is left? What's needed? Not a commander, not a hero, a quartermaster. The most important person in the city, keeping the wounded army on its feet. On the 4th day, Ethan came to him. His arm was in a splint. His face was ashen, but his eyes were alive. He sat down at the counter and said that the guild was gathering forces for a counterattack, that in 3 weeks the united army would march north, to the gates of the abyss. If they were closed, the archdemon would lose its source of power, and the army of the undead would crumble. That was canon. Daniel knew this plan. He knew it worked, but only if the hero had the blade of the Silent Dawn. Without the blade, the gates couldn't be closed. Ethan said he needed the sword, that rusty sword from the very first day. He didn't know why. He couldn't explain it. He just felt it. He felt that this sword was waiting for him, that it was calling to him. Daniel looked at it. 117 days ago, a skinny boy in worn-out boots walked into this shop and sold a rusty sword for 3 copper coins. Now a man sat before Daniel, young, wounded, broken by Silverhold, but he hadn't given up. Daniel stood up. "Follow me," he said. They walked through the shop, through the back room, through the courtyard, into Meyer's workshop. The anvil stood on the hard, packed earth. Daniel asked Meyer to step aside. She looked at him, at Ethan. She nodded. She left. Daniel moved the anvil aside. Beneath it was a lid, a lead box. He took out a key. He opened it. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in canvas. He took it out. He unwrapped it. The blade of Silent Dawn lay on the cloth, rusty, dull, seemingly lifeless. But when Ethan stepped closer, what Daniel had been waiting for over the past 4 months happened. The sword flared to life. Not brightly, not blindingly, quietly, warmly, like the first ray of dawn touching the horizon. The rust cracked. It flaked off onto the canvas. Beneath it, the metal was revealed. Pure, silvery, glowing from within with a soft golden light. The blade. Perfect. The guard shaped like outstretched wings. The hilt wrapped in leather that looked new, even though the sword was hundreds of years old. Recognition. The condition fulfilled. A high-ranking undead, at sunset, on its own. The blade of the Silent Dawn had awakened. Ethan stood and watched, his mouth slightly agape, his eyes wide. He reached out with his good hand. His fingers touched the hilt. The light grew brighter. For a second. Then it settled. A steady, soft glow. The sword fit Ethan's hand like a glove, as if it had been waiting for this very hand, these very fingers. 117 days. Ethan raised the blade. Light, balanced, perfect. He looked at Daniel, and Daniel saw in his eyes something he had never seen once during the 11 simulations on the computer screen in Seoul. Gratitude. Genuine. Real, not pixelated. Ethan said 2 words. "Thank you, Orwin." Daniel nodded. A lump formed in his throat. He swallowed it down. He said that the sword must be cherished, that the blade had properties that would reveal themselves in battle. that against the undead it cut like sunlight, and that at the gates of the abyss this sword was the only thing that could close them. Ethan listened. He nodded. He gripped the hilt. The blade's light pulsed in time with his heartbeat. They returned to the shop, Ethan with the sword at his belt, glowing. The guild fighters in the courtyard saw it and froze. Carl dropped his spoon into his soup. Nora dropped her arrow. Oswy closed the book. Ray Cullen stood at the entrance with his head bandaged, staring at the blade, then at Daniel, then back at the blade, and slowly said that it was the blade of the Silent Dawn, a legend, a relic, a weapon last seen 200 years ago. And there it was, lying in a merchant's shop in Brackenford. Daniel shrugged and said that a good merchant knows the value of things. Ray didn't smile. He looked at Daniel the way one looks at someone they're seeing for the first time, even though they'd met many times. That evening, Daniel sat alone in the shop. Everyone else had left. Ethan and the team were preparing for the expedition. Haven was brewing the last of the potions. Meyer was forging. Emma was checking on the guards. Sora was finally sleeping for the first time in 3 days. Lena was taking inventory. Ari was in the forest. Finn was with her. The shop was empty and quiet. Daniel sat behind the counter and looked at the spot where the blade had lain for 4 months. An empty workbench, a Holsteina, and that was it. He had given away the sword, the main artifact of the story. He had made his choice. He wouldn't go to the gates of the abyss on his own. He wouldn't take the blade and become a hero on his own. He did what he did best. He found the right thing. He preserved it. He perfected it. And he gave it to the one who needed it. "I would have sold it," he would have said aloud in the empty shop. But that boy had already paid. 4 months of blood and fear. A fair price. On the 122nd day, the army marched north. Ethan at the head, the blade at his belt, a light in the morning mist. Behind him, 300 fighters from the Heroes Guild, militia units, mages from the capital, mercenaries, everyone who could wield a weapon. Ray Cullen rode alongside Ethan, staring straight ahead. Daniel stood at the gates of Brackenford, watching the army march away. Standing beside him were Emma, Meyer, Haven, Sora, Ari, Finn, and Lena. 7 people. His people. His shop. His world. The army disappeared behind the hills. Daniel turned and said, "It's time for us to go too." 2 days later, a convoy left Brackenford. Not a military one. A trade convoy. 4 wagons, loaded to the brim. Potions, bandages, food, tools, warm blankets, firewood, cauldrons, bowls, spoons. Everything needed to survive after the battle, no matter who wins. Daniel rode in the first wagon. Next to him was Lena with an account book on her lap. She kept tallying as they went. In the second wagon was Haven with 2 cauldrons and sacks of herbs. She was brewing ointments right on the road. On the third was Mir with tools and a supply of metal. On the fourth was Sora with documents and lists. Every sheet was signed. Every crate was numbered. Emma rode on horseback, a sword at her belt, her eyes on the road. Ari had gone ahead, on reconnaissance. Finn was with her, 2 hunters on the trail. They weren't heading for the gates of the abyss. They were heading for the pass 20 miles to the south. Daniel knew from the cannon that this was exactly where the retreat would take place if the army couldn't break through right away. And this was exactly where there would be the most wounded. A 4-day journey. The supply train moved slowly. The wagons were heavy. The road was rutted by refugees and troops. Daniel sat on the wagon box and looked out at the road. Abandoned belongings lay along the shoulders, broken wagons, torn clothing, a child's straw doll in a ditch, traces of the war that had passed through here a week ago. On the 5th day, they reached the mountain pass. The mountains stood gray and silent. The wind drove icy air from the north through the gorge. Somewhere, out there beyond the mountains, a battle was raging. Daniel couldn't hear a sound. It was too far away, but he could feel it. Something in the air was trembling, subtly, like a string. The storyline was stretched to its limit. He set up a shop, right here, at the pass. A canopy, a table, crates, a sign. Orvin's General Store, always open. Lena wrote out the letters in her impeccable handwriting on a piece of canvas. She hung it above the awning. The wind ruffled the fabric. The letters danced slightly, but they were clearly legible. Emma stood at the entrance. Meyer set up the anvil. Haven lit a fire and hung the cauldron. Sora laid out the documents on a box. Ari sat on a rock higher up the slope and looked north. They waited. 2 days and nothing. Silence. Wind. Cold. Daniel stood behind the counter and waited. On the 3rd day, Ari whistled from above. "They're coming." Daniel looked up. People were coming down the trail from the north. First 10, then 20, then 100. The wounded, the burned, the frostbitten. Archdemons' icy magic. Guild fighters, militiamen, mages without mana, unarmed mercenaries. They walked and fell, got up and walked again. And they saw the shelter at the pass, and the table, and the sign, and the woman with the cauldron, and the merchant behind the counter. The first soldier reached the table. He fell to his knees. Haven was there a second later. Potions, bandages, frostbite ointment. The second soldier, the third, the 10th, the 100th. The stream didn't stop. The shop was running. Like clockwork. Haven treated them. Meyer repaired weapons and armor. Emma lifted those who fell. Sora wrote down names, everyone's. Lena counted the wounded and assigned the order of treatment. Finn hauled water from the stream. Ari climbed down from the cliff and silently began handing out food. Daniel stood behind the counter. To everyone who approached, he gave what they needed. Potions, bread, water, a blanket, a bandage, a word. To each one, personally, looking them in the eye. He didn't know their names. He didn't know their stories, but he could see what they needed, as always. Just like on the first day when he saw Ethan's worn-out boots. Seeing people, that was his only skill. And it worked. By evening, it became clear that the army hadn't retreated. The army had won. The wounded were coming down from the pass, not from defeat, but in the wake of victory. Ethan had closed the gate. The blade had worked. The archdemon had been cast aside. The undead had scattered. The gate was sealed, but the price had been high. Half the army was wounded. A quarter would never return. Ethan reached the pass the next morning, alone, on his own 2 feet, the blade at his belt, extinguished, empty, having given all its power to the gate. Just a sword now. Just steel. Ethan saw a shop, an awning, a table, a sign, people around it. Wounded soldiers being fed, treated, and wrapped in blankets. He walked over, stood in front of the counter, looked at Daniel for a long time. Then he said, "You knew that we would win. You knew the wounded would come here. You knew they'd need all this. That's why you're here." Daniel shook his head. He said he didn't know, that he'd hoped, but he didn't know, and that the shop was here because it had to be where it was needed. Ethan looked at him. Then he took the blade from his belt, dull, dead. He set it on the counter and said, "Give me back my 3 copper coins." Daniel looked at the sword, at the empty, dead blade that an hour ago had been a weapon capable of cutting through gods. Then he looked at Ethan. The boy was smiling, for the first time ever. A wide, genuine smile, like a 16-year-old who just saved the world and was now joking with a merchant. Daniel reached into his pocket. He pulled out 3 copper coins. He placed them on the counter next to the sword. "Here's your change," he said. Ethan laughed. Ray Cullen stood nearby, watching them, and he was shaking his head. And he was smiling too. That evening, Daniel sat by the campfire. The wounded were sleeping all around him. The shop was quiet. The awning flapped in the wind. The sign was slightly askew. Emma sat nearby, sharpening her sword with a familiar, rhythmic motion. Haven slept on sacks of herbs. She had finally run out of steam. Sora had covered herself with a blanket and was lying on a box of documents. Meyer was sitting by the cold anvil, massaging her hands with oil. Ari was somewhere in the darkness, on a rock, in a tree, from where she could see everything. Finn slept curled up next to her. Lena sat by the fire and wrote something in her notebook by the light of the flames. Daniel looked at her. He asked what she was writing. Lena looked up. Her eyes sparkled behind her glasses. She said she was counting the total number of people the shop had helped today. 312. 312 people in a single day. 1 shop, 1 merchant, 7 assistants. A counter at the mountain pass. Daniel stared into the fire. 312. In Seoul, over 10 years of working at an electronics chain, he'd served thousands of customers. He hadn't remembered a single face. Here, in a single day, he'd seen 312 pairs of eyes. And he'd given each one what they needed. Not just any product, a product just for you. He sat by the campfire and thought about Seoul, about the monitor, about the keyboard, about the studio in Gangnam. 4 months ago, he'd fallen asleep at 3 a.m. without saying goodbye to his boss. He'd woken up in another world, in a stranger's body, in a shop with dusty shelves. And he'd built all of this, not with a sword, not with magic, with attention, with care, with the knowledge of what a specific person needs at a specific moment. Emma stopped sharpening her sword. She looked at him. She said it was time to sleep, that tomorrow would be a long day, that the wounded needed to be taken to Brackenford, that the shop needed to be packed up and loaded, that the journey home would take 4 days. Home. She said home. About Brackenford. About the shop. Daniel looked at her. Emma was sitting next to him. Her red hair was in a braid. Her face was calm. Her eyes were tired but warm. She said home and meant his shop. Daniel nodded. He said, "Yes. Home." Then he stood up. He walked over to the awning. He straightened the sign. Orvin's General Store, always open. He returned to the campfire, lay down on the ground, pulled the blanket over himself. The stars above the pass were huge and bright. You don't see stars like that in Seoul. Never. He closed his eyes and fell asleep. Without dreams, without anxiety. For the first time since day 1, he just fell asleep, like a man who's finally home. In the morning, he'll wake up, pack up the stall, load it onto the carts, and head to Brackenford. He'll return to his room above the store. He'll hang his polka-dot apron on a hook, open the shutters, put the kettle on, and start a new day. Because the shop is open, because people will come, and because each of them needs something different. And he knows exactly what that is. Dawn was breaking over the mountains. Quiet. The first truly quiet dawn of the entire war. Exactly as it was written in the name of the sword that is no more. The blade of the quiet dawn. Dawn had come. The blade had faded. But the shop remained. Always open.